The transfer orders hit the table like a slap across the face. Commander Reed Calloway didn't even look up. Get her off my roster. I asked for operators, not nurses. Inside the briefing room at Blackwall Military Medical Center, every soldier in the Special Operations Task Force laughed when a quiet Navy nurse named Kira Ashford walked through the door. To them, she was dead weight, a medical replacement nobody had requested and nobody wanted. What none of them knew was that Kira carried a classified service record as one of the military's most lethal sniper specialists, and someone very powerful had sent her to Thornfield Harbor for a reason none of them would see coming. If you're watching this story, I want you to stay with me until the very end. Drop a like, follow the channel, and comment the name of the city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels. The helicopter set down on the landing pad at Blackwall Military Medical Center at 06:37 on a Tuesday morning in late October, and Kira Ashford stepped off with a single duffel bag over her shoulder and a transfer packet she already knew would cause problems. Thornfield Harbor was the kind of coastal military installation that existed on the edge of everything, wedged between a stretch of rocky Atlantic shoreline and dense pine forest, far enough from any major city that the nearest civilian hospital was 42 minutes by ambulance. The base itself had been expanded 3 times over the past decade, each time absorbing more concrete, more razor wire, more restricted airspace. At its center sat the medical compound, and at the far end of the compound, past the surgical wing and the classified briefing corridors, sat the headquarters of Joint Special Operations Task Force Anvil. That was where Kira had been ordered to report. She walked across the tarmac with her head down, not because she was timid, but because she had learned a long time ago that the quieter you entered a room, the more you saw before anyone noticed you were watching. The wind off the harbor was bitter, carrying salt and diesel fuel. 2 enlisted men loading crates near a transport truck glanced at her, registered the medical insignia on her uniform, and went back to their work without a word. She found the operations building and pushed through the main door. A staff sergeant behind the front desk looked up from a stack of logistics forms. Help you? Lieutenant Kira Ashford, reporting for assignment to Task Force Anvil. The sergeant's eyebrows lifted. He scanned her transfer orders, flipped the page, scanned again. Then he picked up a phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. Sir, there's a Lieutenant Ashford here. Medical transfer. A pause. Yes, sir. Navy nurse. Another pause. Longer this time. Copy that. He hung up and looked at her with an expression she had seen before, the particular mix of pity and second-hand embarrassment that came when someone was about to walk into a situation they hadn't been warned about. Commander Calloway's office is down the hall, second left. He's expecting you. Thank you. Good luck, the sergeant said, and the way he said it told her everything she needed to know. Commander Reed Calloway was 46 years old, built like a man who had never missed a physical training cycle in his adult life, and wore the permanent scowl of someone who believed the entire military bureaucracy existed specifically to make his job harder. He was standing behind his desk when Kira knocked and entered, reading her file with the kind of expression a mechanic might use while inspecting a transmission he knew was already blown. Ashford. Yes, sir. You're a nurse. Navy Nurse Corps, yes, sir. Trauma and Field Medicine certified. Calloway dropped the file on his desk. I put in a request for 2 additional special operations medics with combat deployment experience. Instead, I got 1 Navy nurse with a background in, he glanced at the file again, fleet hospital rotations and shipboard medical support. He looked at her the way you'd look at a wrong part delivered to a job site. You understand what this unit does? I've been briefed on the general operational profile, sir. The general profile. He almost smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Task Force Anvil runs direct action raids, high-value target extractions, and counterterrorism operations in denied environments. We don't do general. Every person in this unit has been through selection, qualified in advanced combat medicine, and deployed to active theaters. Most of them have been shot at. Several of them have been shot. He paused. Have you ever been shot at, Lieutenant? My service record is in the file, sir. I read your service record. It's thin. Kira said nothing. She held his gaze and kept her hands still at her sides. And she let the silence do what silence always did. It made the other person keep talking. Calloway exhaled through his nose. I'm going to be straight with you. I don't know who approved this transfer, and I don't know why they sent you here instead of someone qualified for this environment. But I don't have the authority to reject personnel orders from Naval Medical Command, so you're here." He picked up a pen and signed something without looking at it. "You'll be assigned to the medical support section. You will not participate in operational planning. You will not attend mission briefings. You will not deploy with strike teams. You will provide supplemental medical coverage in the clinic and stay out of the way. Are we clear?" "Boss, much it." "Crystal clear, sir." "Dismissed." Kira picked up her signed intake form and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She didn't clench her jaw. She didn't do anything that would have given him the satisfaction of knowing the conversation had landed. But it had landed, every word. The barracks assigned to support personnel were on the opposite side of the compound from the operator's quarters. A deliberate geographic statement about who mattered and who didn't. Kira found her rack, stowed her gear, and sat on the edge of the thin mattress for exactly 90 seconds. Then she stood up, changed into her working uniform, and walked to the medical clinic to begin her first shift. The clinic was small and understaffed. 2 corpsmen rotated 12-hour shifts, handling everything from routine sick call to minor trauma. The senior corpsman was a second-class petty officer named Briggs, who had been at Blackwall for 14 months and looked like he hadn't slept for at least 12 of them. "So you're the replacement," Briggs said, barely glancing up from his paperwork. "Looks like it." "Commander tell you how things work around here?" "He told me to stay out of the way." Briggs snorted. "Yeah, that tracks. Listen, the operators don't come to this clinic unless they're bleeding bad enough to leave a trail. They've got their own medical guys embedded in the teams. You and me, we handle the support staff, the admin folks, and whatever overflow the team medics don't want to deal with." He tossed her a laminated schedule. "Shift starts at 0600, ends at 1800. Don't be late, don't touch anything in the restricted pharmacy cabinet without logging it, and don't try to make friends with the snake eaters. They'll eat you alive." Cheating. "Got it. One more thing." Briggs paused, looking at her for the first time with something approaching directness. "There was a nurse here before you. Lasted 3 weeks. The operators made her life so miserable she put in a transfer request and was gone by the end of the month." He shrugged. "Just so you know what you're walking into." Kira nodded. "Appreciate the honesty." She spent the next 4 days doing exactly what she had been told to do. She ran the clinic. She treated minor injuries, a sprained wrist, a laceration from a broken equipment crate, an upper respiratory infection that had worked its way through half the administrative staff. She was competent, efficient, and invisible, which was exactly what she wanted to be. But she was also watching. Blackwall was a tightly controlled facility, and Task Force Anvil operated inside an even tighter bubble within it. Access was compartmentalized. Information moved through secure channels. Operational planning happened behind closed doors with biometric locks. On paper, it was a model of military security discipline. In practice, Kira noticed cracks almost immediately. On her second day, she saw an administrative coordinator named Nathan Price walking out of the Secure Communications building at 2200, 2 hours after his shift had ended and well outside the window when anyone in his role had business in that part of the compound. He was carrying a laptop bag that looked heavier than it should have been. On her third day, she overheard 2 operators in the clinic hallway talking about a recent mission that had gone sideways, a raid in which the target had been moved to an alternate location less than 6 hours before the strike team arrived. One of them used the word compromised. The other told him to shut up. On her 4th day, she found a USB drive on the floor of the medical supply closet. It was unmarked, tucked into a corner near the ventilation grate, as if it had been placed there rather than dropped. She picked it up, examined it, put it back exactly where she found it, and memorized its position. None of this was in her transfer orders. Her transfer orders said she was a Navy nurse assigned to supplemental medical support. But Kira Ashford's actual orders, the ones that existed on a classified server accessible to exactly 4 people in the entire Department of Defense, said something very different. The first real confrontation came on day 5. Kira was in the clinic restocking trauma supplies when a group of 4 operators walked in. They weren't there for medical attention. They were there because word had gotten around that the new nurse was quiet, kept to herself, and most importantly, hadn't pushed back against any of the treatment she'd received. In certain military cultures, that kind of passivity was interpreted as weakness, and weakness attracted predators. The lead operator was a master sergeant named Holt. Big guy, square jaw, the kind of man who filled a doorway and knew it. He leaned against the supply cabinet and crossed his arms. "So you're the nurse." Kira didn't look up from the inventory she was counting. "That's what it says on my orders. Heard Calloway put you on a short leash. No briefings, no deployments, no nothing. Just Band-Aids and paperwork." He grinned at his companions. "Must be nice. Safe little corner while the rest of us do the real work." "Everybody's got a role," Kira said evenly. "See, that's the thing." Holt stepped closer. "In this unit, your role is supposed to mean something. Every person here earned their spot. Selection, qualification, combat tours. You walked in off a hospital ship with a stethoscope and a transfer stamp. That's not earning a spot? That's filling a seat." Kira set down her clipboard and looked at him for the first time. Her expression was flat, unreadable, and completely still. "You finished?" Something in her eyes made Holt hesitate, just for a fraction of a second. Then he recovered, laughed, and slapped the supply cabinet hard enough to rattle the contents. "Yeah, I'm finished. For now." The four of them walked out, and Kira stood alone in the clinic, her hands perfectly steady, her breathing perfectly controlled, and a cold, focused anger burning in her chest that she had no intention of showing to anyone. She had been underestimated before, many times, by people far more dangerous than Master Sergeant Holt. It never ended the way they expected. Day 6 brought the training exercise that changed everything. Task Force Anvil was running a combined live fire and urban assault drill in a mock village constructed on the western edge of the base. The village was a cluster of plywood and concrete structures designed to simulate a hostile urban environment. Narrow streets, blind corners, elevated firing positions. The operators moved through it in four-man teams, clearing rooms, engaging pop-up targets, and coordinating movement under simulated combat conditions. Kira had not been invited. She had not been authorized to be anywhere near the training range, but she had heard the exercise schedule through the clinic's radio traffic, and she positioned herself at the medical staging area adjacent to the range, the one designated spot where a medical professional was supposed to be standing by during live fire training. The spot had been empty for the last 3 exercises because no one had bothered to fill it. She was there for 11 minutes before it happened. A young specialist named Harlan Voss, 23 years old, on his first assignment with the task force, was moving through the second story of a concrete structure when the floor gave way. The building had been marked as structurally sound during the last safety inspection, but a combination of water damage, freeze-thaw cycles, and the weight of a 200-pound man in full kit proved that inspection wrong. Voss fell 8 feet through rotted concrete and rebar, landing on a pile of construction debris. The sound he made when he hit was the kind of noise that stopped everyone within earshot, a compressed, involuntary scream that cut off almost immediately as the pain overwhelmed his ability to process it. His left leg was shattered. A piece of rebar had punched through his calf and exited below the knee, and the femur above it was visibly deformed. Blood was pooling fast. His body armor had protected his torso, but the impact had driven the wind out of him, and he was struggling to breathe, which meant possible rib fractures and potential pneumothorax. The range safety officer called a ceasefire. Operators converged on the building, and for approximately 45 seconds, nobody did anything useful. It wasn't cowardice. These were trained combat operators who had performed under fire, but the specific combination of a structural collapse, an arterially compromised limb injury, and a casualty who was partially buried under debris created a scenario that fell outside the immediate action drills they had rehearsed. The team medic assigned to Voss's element was on the far side of the village, 3 buildings away, sprinting but not yet on scene. Kira was there in under a minute. She came through the ground floor entrance of the collapsed structure carrying a trauma bag she had staged at the medical point, and she moved with the kind of controlled urgency that only came from having done this exact thing in conditions far worse than a training range. "Everyone back up. Give me space." Her voice was calm, clear, and carried an authority that had nothing to do with her rank. 2 operators who outranked her by years stepped aside without thinking about it. She dropped to her knees next to Voss. His face was gray. His breathing was rapid and shallow. His left leg was a mess. The rebar had created an open fracture with active hemorrhage, and the angle of the femur told her the break was mid-shaft with possible vascular involvement. "Specialist Voss, I'm Lieutenant Ashford. I need you to stay with me." Can you tell me where the pain is worst? My leg. I can't. He tried to move and screamed again. Don't move, I've got you. She was already cutting away the fabric around the wound, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She applied a tourniquet above the knee, cinched it tight, and marked the time on his skin with a marker from her pocket. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop completely. The rebar was acting as a partial plug, and removing it in the field would be catastrophic. I need a litter and a vehicle at the east entrance now, she called over her shoulder. And get the surgical team on standby. Open fracture, left tibia fibula with rebar impalement, probable femur fracture, possible vascular compromise. He's going to need the OR within the hour or he loses this leg. One of the operators stared at her. How do you get the vehicle? Now! He ran. Kira turned back to Voss. His blood pressure was dropping. She could see it in his skin color, in the way his eyes were losing focus. She started an IV line, hung a bag of saline, and began pushing fluids. While she worked, she talked to him. Not the scripted reassurance of a textbook, real words, the kind that kept a scared kid anchored to consciousness. Hey, look at me. You're 23 years old and you've got a busted leg. That's it. That's all this is. The surgeons here are good and they're going to put you back together, but I need you to keep breathing for me. Slow breaths, in through your nose. Can you do that? It hurts. It hurts so bad. I know it does. I'm going to give you something for the pain right now, but I need you to keep talking to me. Where are you from? Virginia, Norfolk area. Yeah? You got family there? My mom. My sister. Good. You're going to call them tonight and tell them you had a rough day at work. That's the worst thing that happens today. You hear me? Voss nodded, tears cutting lines through the dust on his face. The team medic arrived 30 seconds later, breathing hard, already pulling on gloves. He took one look at what Kira had done. The tourniquet, the IV, the stabilized impalement site, the marked vitals, and stopped. Who did this? I did, Kira said without looking up. She was splinting the femur now, immobilizing the entire leg to prevent further vascular damage during transport. The medic knelt beside her and watched her work for 3 seconds. Then he said quietly, "That's a perfect field reduction setup. Where did you learn that?" "It's in the manual." "No, it isn't. Not like that." Kira didn't answer. The vehicle arrived. She supervised the transfer onto the litter, maintained the IV line during movement, and rode in the back of the transport to the surgical wing. She gave the surgical team a handoff report that was so precise and complete that the lead surgeon later told the chief of staff it was the best field-to-OR transition he had seen in 11 years at Blackwall. Specialist Harlan Voss went into surgery at 09:14. He came out at 12:47. His leg was saved. His career was saved. And when the surgical team reviewed the field treatment, they concluded that if the tourniquet had been applied even 90 seconds later, the blood loss would have been irreversible. 90 seconds. That was the margin between Harlan Voss walking again and Harlan Voss spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair. By that evening, the story had traveled through the entire task force. The details shifted with each retelling, the way they always did. Some versions had Kira pulling Voss out of the rubble with her bare hands. Others had her performing surgery on the spot. But the core facts were consistent. The nurse had been the first one there. The nurse had known exactly what to do. The nurse had saved the kid's leg when everyone else was still figuring out how to react. Commander Calloway heard the report from his executive officer and said nothing for a long time. Then he pulled up Kira Ashford's service record and read it again, more carefully this time. It was still thin. Fleet hospital rotations, shipboard medical support, nothing that explained the level of trauma expertise she had demonstrated on that range. Something didn't add up. And Calloway, whatever his flaws, was not a man who ignored things that didn't add up. That night, Kira sat in her quarters with the door closed, writing a report that would never appear in any official medical log. She wrote it on a device that looked like a standard military tablet, but contained an encrypted communication suite accessible to a chain of command that didn't appear on any organizational chart at Blackwall. She documented the incident with Voss, not because it was relevant to her actual mission, but because it had changed her operational position within the unit. Before today, she had been invisible, which was useful. After today, she was visible, which was dangerous. People would be watching her now, asking questions, wanting to know where a Navy nurse had learned to perform battlefield trauma management at a level that matched or exceeded their own team medics. She would need a cover story. She would need it fast, but the more pressing issue was what she had observed during the exercise. While everyone's attention had been focused on the collapse and the casualty, Kira had been in a position to see the entire training range from the medical staging area, and she had noticed something that no one else had been looking for. Nathan Price, the administrative coordinator she had seen leaving the secure communications building after hours on her second night, had been standing at the edge of the range observation platform. He had no operational reason to be there. Administrative personnel were not involved in training exercises. But there he was, holding a tablet, watching the exercise with an intensity that went beyond casual interest. And twice during the exercise, she had seen him photograph the range layout with the tablet's camera. The range layout included the positioning of teams, the movement routes, the timing of phase transitions, and the locations of simulated high-value targets. It was a mirror of actual operational planning methodology. Anyone with access to that layout would understand how Anvil structured its real-world missions. Kira closed her encrypted report and transmitted it through a channel that bounced through 3 relay points before reaching its destination. 12 seconds later, she received a response. 3 words. Continue monitoring. Patience. She deleted the message, powered down the device, and lay on her rack staring at the ceiling. Patience. That was what they always said. Continue monitoring. Collect evidence. Build the case. Don't move until the picture is complete. But the picture was already starting to come into focus, and what she was seeing made her chest tighten with something that went beyond professional concern. If Nathan Price was what she suspected he was, if someone inside Task Force Anvil was systematically leaking operational intelligence, then every mission this unit had run in recent months was potentially compromised. Every operator who had gone through a door, every helicopter that had crossed into hostile airspace, every target package that had been assembled and executed had been done with the enemy potentially knowing they were coming. That wasn't just a security breach. That was a death sentence, walking around in a uniform. The next morning, Kira arrived at the clinic to find Briggs waiting for her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it. Respect. Heard about what you did on the range, he said. Just did my job. Yeah, well, your job saved that kid's leg. The surgical team is talking about it. The operators are talking about it. Even Calloway's talking about it. And that man doesn't talk about anything he can avoid talking about. Briggs handed her a coffee. You might not be as invisible as you think anymore. That was exactly what concerned her. At 09:30, she received a summons to Commander Calloway's office. She walked in and stood at attention, expecting a brief acknowledgement and a return to the status quo. What she got instead was Calloway staring at her with an expression that mixed something close to reluctant admiration with deep, structural suspicion. Sit down, Ashford. She sat. I reviewed the surgical team's report on Specialist Voss. The lead surgeon described your field intervention as, and I'm quoting, consistent with Level 1 trauma center protocols executed under combat conditions. That's not a phrase that gets used to describe the work of a fleet hospital nurse. I've had extensive trauma training, sir. Where? Various programs and deployments. It's documented in my training record. I looked at your training record, Advanced Trauma Life Support Certification, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, Navy Trauma Medicine Pipeline. All standard qualifications. Nothing in there explains how you performed a combat-grade damage control intervention on a polytrauma casualty while surrounded by panicking operators and made it look like you were filling out a grocery list. Kira held his gaze. Some people perform better under pressure, sir. Calloway leaned forward. Who are you, Ashford? The question hung in the air between them. Not a casual question. Not an administrative inquiry. A real question from a man who had spent 20 years learning how to read people and who was suddenly aware that the person sitting across from him was not the person described in the file on his desk. I'm a Navy nurse assigned to supplemental medical support for Task Force Anvil, Kira said, as per my transfer orders. Calloway held her gaze for a long time. Then he exhaled and leaned back. Effective immediately, you're authorized to attend operational medical briefings. Not mission briefings, but medical briefings. You'll assist the team medics with pre-deployment medical readiness assessments and post-operation casualty reviews. You're still not deploying with strike teams, and you're still not in the planning cycle. But after what happened yesterday, I'd be a fool to keep you in the clinic counting aspirin. Yes, sir. Dismissed. She stood and walked to the door. Ashford. She turned. What you did for Voss was exceptional. I want you to know that I recognize it. Thank you, sir. She left, and Calloway sat alone in his office for a full minute, turning her personnel file over in his hands. Then he picked up a secure phone and dialed a number he rarely used, the direct line to the Naval Medical Command liaison at the Pentagon. This is Commander Calloway at Blackwall. I need the full background package on a Lieutenant Kira Ashford. And I don't mean the version you sent me. I mean the real one. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. Commander, I'll need to verify your authorization level before we can discuss that personnel file. Why would you need to verify my authorization to access the file of someone assigned to my own unit? Another pause, longer this time. I'll have someone contact you within 24 hours, sir. The line went dead. Calloway set the phone down slowly. In 23 years of military service, he had never been told he needed authorization to review the file of someone under his command. Personnel records were routine. Access was automatic, unless the file was flagged. Unless there was a compartment above his clearance level that contained the parts of Kira Ashford's career that didn't appear in the thin, unremarkable record sitting on his desk. He looked out his window toward the medical compound, where a nurse who moved like an operator and performed like a combat surgeon was walking back to her clinic as if nothing had happened. Something was very wrong at Blackwall. And Commander Reed Calloway was no longer sure which direction the threat was coming from. Across the compound, in a small office adjacent to the logistics section, Nathan Price sat at his desk reviewing a spreadsheet that contained supply chain data for base operations. It was the kind of work that nobody paid attention to because it was the kind of work that nobody considered important. Requisition forms, vendor contracts, inventory reconciliation, the invisible machinery that kept a military installation running. Price was good at his job. He had been at Blackwall for 19 months, had received consistently positive performance reviews, and had earned the trust of everyone from the base commander to the lowest-ranking supply clerk. He was polite, efficient, unremarkable, and helpful. The kind of person who faded into the institutional wallpaper so completely that people forgot he was in the room, which was, of course, the entire point. At 22:15 that night, after the administrative section had emptied and the hallway lights had dimmed to their overnight settings, Price unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a phone that was not government-issued. He connected to a network that was not on the base's communications infrastructure, and he sent a message that contained the training range layout photographs he had captured the previous day, annotated with timestamps, team designations, and movement patterns. The message traveled through a series of encrypted relays and arrived at its destination 11 seconds later. The response came back in 45 seconds. A single line. Next operational package, timeline critical. Price deleted the exchange, powered down the phone, returned it to the drawer, and locked it. He sat for a moment in the dim light of his office, listening to the distant sound of helicopters on the flight line and the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Then he straightened his collar, picked up a stack of requisition forms, and walked out into the hallway like a man who had nothing to hide and nowhere unusual to be. 800 meters away, lying in her rack with her eyes open in the dark, Kira Ashford stared at the ceiling and ran through every piece of information she had collected in 6 days. The pattern was there. She could feel it, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Not with your eyes, not with your instruments, but with something deeper, something instinctive, something that had kept her alive in places far more dangerous than Thornfield Harbor. Someone inside Task Force Anvil was bleeding information, and whoever it was, they were very, very good at it. She turned on her side, closed her eyes, and forced her breathing to slow. Tomorrow, she would have access to the medical briefings. That meant she would be inside the operational perimeter, close enough to observe the flow of classified information in real time. Close enough to see who accessed what, when, and why. Close enough to find the traitor. But as she lay there in the darkness, a thought crept in that she couldn't quite push away. The kind of thought that came at night when the operational discipline loosened and the human part of the mind took over. The look on Calloway's face when he'd asked her who she really was. He was getting close to asking the right questions. And when he got the answers, or when he was denied the answers, which would tell him just as much, things at Blackwall were going to start moving very fast. Faster, maybe, than she was ready for. And somewhere in the compound, behind a locked drawer in a quiet office, a phone sat in the darkness, waiting for its next instruction from an enemy that already knew far too much about what this task force was planning to do next. The next instruction from an enemy that already knew far too much arrived sooner than anyone expected. 3 days after the training range incident, Task Force Anvil launched Operation Bright Falcon, a raid targeting a logistics coordinator for a transnational weapons trafficking network operating out of a coastal warehouse district 70 miles south of Thornfield Harbor. The intelligence package had been assembled over 6 weeks. Surveillance assets had confirmed the target's pattern of life. The strike team had rehearsed entry and extraction until every operator could run the plan blindfolded. The target was gone, not captured by a competing agency, not killed in an unrelated incident, gone, as in relocated to an unknown position within a window so narrow that it could only mean one thing. Someone with access to the operational timeline had passed it forward. The strike team hit an empty building. No target, no associates, no equipment, just bare concrete floors and the faint chemical smell of recently wiped surfaces. Whoever had been there had cleared out with enough time to sanitize the site, but not enough to make it look like the space had never been used. Kira heard the debrief through the medical briefing channel she had been authorized to monitor. She wasn't in the room, that access hadn't been granted, but the post-operation medical review included enough context for her to understand what had happened. The mission had failed. Nobody was injured, which kept it out of the casualty reporting pipeline, but the operational failure itself was significant. Bright Falcon had been the task force's highest priority target for over a month. She added it to the pattern. In the 13 months before her arrival, Task Force Anvil had executed 22 operations. 14 had succeeded. 8 had experienced some form of compromise. Targets relocated, ambush positions pre-staged, routes interdicted, safe houses emptied. The failure rate was abnormally high for a unit with Anvil's resources and intelligence support, but each individual failure could be attributed to the ordinary friction of special operations. Bad luck. Stale intelligence. Operational security lapses at the source level. No single failure was damning enough to trigger an investigation on its own, but taken together, the pattern told a different story. And Kira had been sent to Blackwall specifically because an analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency had done exactly that, taken them together, and had flagged the statistical anomaly to a compartmented counterintelligence directorate that operated under the code name Meridian. Meridian didn't officially exist. It had no office, no letterhead, no entry in the Department of Defense organizational directory. It existed as a network of operatives embedded in military units across the service branches, tasked with identifying and neutralizing insider threats that conventional counterintelligence channels were too slow or too compromised to catch. Kira was Meridian's operative at Blackwall, and after Operation Bright Falcon, she was running out of patience with the word patience. The morning after the failed raid, the mood inside the task force was poisonous. Operators who had trained for weeks on a mission that evaporated on contact were cycling through the predictable stages: anger, frustration, suspicion, blame. Kira encountered it firsthand when she reported to the medical section for the post-operation wellness checks that were now part of her expanded duties. Staff Sergeant Luke Maddox was the first operator through the door. He was 31, lean, intense, with the coiled energy of a man who had spent the previous night lying in a hide site, waiting for a target who never appeared. He sat on the examination table and pulled up his sleeve for a blood pressure check without making eye contact. "Rough night," Kira said, wrapping the cuff. Don't what? Don't do the concerned medical professional thing. I don't need someone to talk about my feelings. I need someone to explain how a target we've been watching for 6 weeks disappears 12 hours before we kick the door. That's above my pay grade. Maddox looked at her for the first time. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a tightness around his jaw that came from clenching it for hours. "You know what's funny? Before you showed up, I'd never seen a nurse who moves the way you do. The thing on the range with Voss? I've seen combat medics with 3 deployments who couldn't have done what you did. And now you're sitting in medical briefings, asking questions about operational timelines and personnel access protocols. That's not nurse behavior." Kira released the pressure on the cuff and noted the reading. 140/90. That's elevated. That's because I'm pissed off. Fair enough. It'll come down. Drink water, not coffee. She stripped off her gloves and dropped them in the waste bin. And for what it's worth, Maddox, you're right to be angry. A mission doesn't fall apart like that without a reason. Someone should be asking hard questions. Someone should? Then ask them. He studied her face for a long beat, trying to read something in her expression that she wasn't giving away. Then he stood up, rolled his sleeve down, and walked out. That conversation was the beginning of something Kira hadn't anticipated. An ally. Not a formal alliance, nothing she could use in an operational context, but a human connection with someone inside the strike teams who was already asking the same questions she was. It was useful, and it was dangerous, because the more people who started pulling at the thread, the more likely the thread would snap before she was ready. She needed to move faster. That afternoon, she used her access to the medical briefing system to pull the personnel medical records of every member of the task force's administrative and support staff. It was a legitimate action. She was conducting a routine review of immunization compliance and physical readiness documentation, which fell squarely within her assigned duties. But buried inside those records were the access logs that tracked when each staff member had visited the medical section. And those logs included timestamps that could be cross-referenced against other facility access records. Nathan Price's medical file showed 14 clinic visits in 19 months. That was within normal range. But 7 of those visits had occurred on the same dates as operational planning milestones, the days when mission packages were finalized and distributed to the teams involved. The correlation could be coincidental. People got sick regardless of the operational calendar. But Kira had learned a long time ago that coincidence was the first disguise a pattern wore before it revealed itself. She needed Price's facility access logs. The full set, not just the medical timestamps, but every door he badged through, every system he logged into, every time he entered and exited the compound. Those records existed in the base security office, and she had no authorization to access them. But she knew someone who did. Commander Calloway had been making calls since their last conversation. Kira knew this because the Naval Medical Command liaison at the Pentagon had not responded to his inquiry within the promised 24 hours, which meant his request had been flagged and escalated to someone with the authority to decide whether Reed Calloway should be told the truth about the nurse assigned to his unit. That decision would take time. Bureaucracies moved at bureaucratic speed, even classified ones. And in the meantime, Calloway was doing what any competent commander would do when confronted with a mystery inside his own perimeter. He was investigating on his own. Kira found him in the operations building late that evening, standing in front of a wall-mounted timeline that tracked all of Anvil's recent operations. He had added color-coded annotations, green for successful missions, red for compromised ones, and he was staring at the pattern with the same expression a doctor uses when looking at a scan that confirms the diagnosis they were hoping not to find. "Sir." He didn't turn around. "What do you see, Ashford?" She looked at the timeline. The red markers weren't random. They clustered around operations that had been planned using a specific intelligence dissemination pathway, the one that routed through the administrative coordination section for logistical support scheduling. "I see a pattern," she said. "So do I." He turned to face her. 8 compromised operations in 13 months. Every single one of them went through the standard planning pipeline. The 4 most recent ones all had administrative logistics coordination requests filed within 48 hours of execution. That narrows the access window. It narrows it to about 6 people. He crossed his arms. "I called the Pentagon about your file. They stonewalled me." "I'm not surprised." "No, I imagine you're not." He took a step toward her. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that the answer matters. Not for your career, not for the chain of command, but for the safety of every operator in this building. Are you here because of what I'm looking at on that wall?" Kira held his gaze. Every instinct she had, every protocol, every operational security principle, every directive from Meridian told her to deflect, deny, and maintain her cover. But she was looking at a man who had just independently identified the same threat she had been sent to investigate, and who was standing in front of the evidence with nobody to help him understand what it meant. She made a decision that violated her orders. "Yes." Calloway exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for days. "Who sent you?" "I can't tell you that, not yet. But I can tell you that the pattern you're seeing is real, and the source is inside this compound." How long have you known? I was briefed before I arrived, but I didn't have confirmation until Bright Falcon failed. So everything, the nurse cover, the thin file, the transfer from Naval Medical Command, all of it was a placement operation. Yes, Calloway turned back to the timeline and stared at it for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, controlled, and carrying the specific weight of a man who had just learned that his house had been burning from the inside while he stood on the lawn complaining about the weather. People have died, Ashford. Operations that were compromised didn't just fail. Operators got hurt. Rodriguez took shrapnel in Kandahar because the exfil route was ambushed. Park nearly bled out in a vehicle rollover that happened because the route was interdicted. I thought it was bad luck. I told myself it was the cost of doing business in hostile territory. He paused. It wasn't bad luck, was it? No, sir, it wasn't. Do you know who? I have a primary suspect. I don't have enough to act on yet. Who? Commander? If I tell you that, and you change your behavior toward that person in any way at all, we lose the case. They destroy evidence, they change their communication protocols, and we never get the proof we need for a prosecution. The people who were hurt, the operations that failed, none of it gets answered. Calloway's jaw tightened. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The commander who wanted to act immediately against the intelligence professional, who understood that premature action would be worse than no action at all. How long? Days, not weeks. I'm close. What do you need from me? 2 things. First, keep running operations normally. Don't cancel anything. Don't change the planning pipeline. Don't restrict access. If the source detects a change in operational tempo, they'll go dark. And second, I need access to the base security office records. Specifically, I need facility access logs for all administrative and support personnel going back 12 months. Calloway reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a key card, and handed it to her. Security office. Tell them I authorized it. If they ask why, tell them it's for a medical compliance audit. Thank you, sir. Ashford. His voice stopped her at the door. When this is over, whoever sent you here, whatever organization you actually work for, you're going to sit in that chair and tell me everything. Not the classified version, not the redacted version. Everything. Because I've been commanding this unit for 2 years, and I've been looking at these men and women every day, and one of them has been killing us from the inside, and I didn't see it. I need to understand how that happened. When this is over, sir, I'll tell you everything I can. She walked out, and the weight of what she had just done settled across her shoulders like a physical load. She had broken operational security. She had revealed her purpose to someone outside Meridian's chain of command. If her handler found out, and handlers always found out, there would be consequences. But Calloway had the access she needed, and the clock was running, and Nathan Price was still sitting in his office with a phone in a locked drawer and a pipeline to an enemy that was getting exactly what it wanted from the most sensitive military unit on the eastern seaboard. The security office records confirmed what Kira had suspected. Nathan Price's facility access patterns showed regular, unremarkable movement during duty hours, the kind of badge swipe timeline you would expect from a diligent administrative coordinator who arrived early, left on time, and spent his day moving between the logistics office, the supply warehouse, and the administrative conference rooms. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But the overnight records told a different story. On 11 separate occasions over the past 9 months, Price had badged into the Secure Communications building between 21:30 and 23:30. Hours when the building was minimally staffed and the overnight watch team consisted of a single communication specialist who monitored encrypted channels and rarely left the operations floor. Price's access had been logged at the building's secondary entrance, a service door on the east side that was used primarily for maintenance and supply deliveries. Each of those 11 occasions fell within 72 hours of a compromised operation. Kira documented the correlation and added it to her encrypted report. She now had 3 independent data points linking Price to the intelligence leak, the after-hours communications building access, the medical visit timing correlation, and the training range photograph she had observed him taking. None of it was conclusive on its own. All of it together painted a picture that any counterintelligence analyst would recognize instantly. But recognition and prosecution were different things. To build a case that would hold up before a military tribunal, she needed direct evidence of information transfer, The actual act of transmitting classified material to an unauthorized recipient. She needed to catch him in the act. That meant surveillance. Close, sustained, real-time surveillance of a target who operated inside the same compound she lived in, who had established patterns of behavior designed to avoid detection, and who would recognize the signs of counterintelligence interest the moment anyone started paying too much attention. Kira planned her approach over the next 48 hours. She maintained her normal routine, clinic shifts, medical briefings, post-operation reviews, while building a surveillance schedule around Price's known patterns. She positioned herself at observation points that offered sightlines to the secure communications building's east entrance without requiring her to be anywhere she couldn't explain. The medical supply warehouse, the pharmacy annex, the overnight duty roster rotation that she volunteered for, claiming she wanted to free up Briggs for a long overdue rest cycle. Briggs accepted the offer without question. "You sure? Night shifts here are dead. Nothing happens." "That's fine. I could use the quiet." On her second overnight shift, she saw Price. It was 2147. The compound was dark except for the security lighting and the steady glow from the operations center windows. Kira was in the pharmacy annex, which shared a wall with the medical supply warehouse and had a window that overlooked the access road leading to the secure communications building. She had positioned herself there with a clipboard and an inventory checklist that gave her a plausible reason to be awake and working. Price walked along the access road carrying his laptop bag. He moved with the practiced casualness of someone who had made this walk many times. Not hurrying, not skulking, just a man going about his business at an hour when most of the base was asleep. He approached the east entrance, swiped his badge, and disappeared inside. Kira noted the time and settled in to wait. 23 minutes later, Price emerged. The laptop bag looked the same, but his body language had changed. There was a quickness to his stride that hadn't been there before, a tension in his shoulders that suggested urgency. He turned left instead of heading back toward the administrative section, taking a path that led toward the motor pool and the perimeter fence. Kira followed. She stayed 200 meters back, using the buildings and shadows the way she had been trained to use terrain, always maintaining cover, always keeping a visual without exposing her position, always having an explanation ready for why she was there if someone spotted her. She was a nurse returning from the pharmacy annex. She was checking on a supply delivery. She was getting fresh air after a long shift. Price stopped near the motor pool maintenance bay, an area that was unmonitored by security cameras due to an ongoing facilities dispute about who was responsible for the camera installation. Base operations said it was the motor pool commander's responsibility. The motor pool commander said it was base operations, and in the gap between bureaucratic territories, a blind spot had existed for 7 months. He sat on a concrete barrier, opened his laptop bag, and removed the phone. Kira was close enough to see the glow of the screen, but not close enough to read what was on it. She watched him type for approximately 2 minutes, pause, read a response, type again, and then power down the phone and return it to the bag. The entire exchange took less than 4 minutes. She had him. Not in the legal sense. She hadn't captured the content of the communication, and she couldn't testify to what was on the phone without examining it. But she had established a pattern of clandestine behavior, confirmed the existence of an unauthorized communication device, identified the blind spot he was using to avoid surveillance, and correlated his activity with the timing of compromised operations. It was enough to bring in the team. She returned to the pharmacy annex, locked the door, and transmitted her report through the encrypted channel. This time, the report was longer and more detailed than any she had sent before. It included everything: the access logs, the timing correlations, the training range photographs, the overnight communications building visits, the unauthorized phone, the motor pool dead zone. She requested immediate support from Meridian and recommended that a counterintelligence apprehension team be deployed to Blackwall within 72 hours. The response came back in under a minute, longer than the usual 3-word directives. Acknowledged. Orion inbound within 48 hours. Maintain position. Do not confront subject. Critical. Next operational cycle must proceed as planned. Subject must believe environment is unchanged. Orion. Kira had heard the name, but had never met the person behind it. A senior Meridian director who handled the highest priority counterintelligence operations. The cases where the damage was severe enough that someone with institutional authority needed to be physically present to coordinate the takedown. If Orion was coming to Blackwall, It meant the scope of this was bigger than she had estimated, and the instruction to let the next operational cycle proceed meant they were going to use Price's own pipeline against him, feed him information about a real or simulated operation, and track it to its destination, confirming not just that Price was the source, but identifying who was receiving the intelligence on the other end. It was the right call, tactically, but it meant that the next Operation Task Force Anvil ran would be executed with the full knowledge that the enemy might know they were coming. Operators would be walking into potential ambushes while counterintelligence watched to see where the leak flowed. Kira stared at the screen for a long time after she deleted the message. Then she closed her eyes and leaned back against the pharmacy wall. She thought about Staff Sergeant Maddox sitting on the examination table with bloodshot eyes, asking how a target disappears 12 hours before the raid. She thought about the operators whose names appeared in the casualty reports from compromised missions. Rodriguez with his shrapnel wounds, Park, who nearly bled out on a road that should have been clear. She thought about Specialist Voss lying in the recovery ward with titanium rods in his leg, too young to understand that the training exercise that nearly killed him was part of the same poisoned ecosystem. And she thought about Nathan Price sitting on a concrete barrier in the dark, typing messages on an unauthorized phone with the calm efficiency of a man who had made a business decision about other people's lives. The anger she felt was precise and cold and very, very useful. 2 days later, Commander Calloway briefed the task force on Operation Stonewall, a direct action mission targeting a logistics node for the same trafficking network that had slipped through their hands during Bright Falcon. The intelligence was fresh, the target location had been confirmed by multiple sources, and the strike window was narrow, 48 hours from the initial brief to execution. The briefing followed standard protocols. Mission packages were distributed to the team leaders. Support requests were routed through the administrative coordination section for logistics scheduling. Equipment manifests were prepared, transportation was arranged, and the operational security protocols were followed exactly as they had been for every previous mission, including the one part of those protocols that Nathan Price had been exploiting for months. Kira watched the information flow through the system and felt the particular tension of knowing that every step of the process was simultaneously real and staged. The mission was real. The target existed. The intelligence was valid. The operators would actually deploy. But the operational details had been carefully calibrated by Meridian to create a controlled test. Specific elements of the plan, the primary approach route, the timing of the initial breach, the location of the extraction point, had been altered from the version distributed through the standard pipeline. If those specific elements were compromised, it would prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the leak had originated from someone with access to the standard distribution, and the access logs would narrow it to Price. It was elegant. It was also terrifying because real operators were going to be on the ground with real weapons in a real hostile environment while counterintelligence played chess with their lives. The morning before the operation, Kira was in the medical section running pre-deployment physicals when the door opened and a man she had never seen walked in. He was mid-50s, gray at the temples, wearing a service uniform with no visible rank insignia or unit patches. His face had the weathered quality of someone who had spent decades in places that aged you faster than years alone could account for. He moved through the medical section as if he already knew the layout, nodding to Briggs as he passed, and stopped in front of Kira with an expression that managed to be simultaneously warm and completely unreadable. "Lieutenant Ashford, I'm Director Walsh. We need to talk." Orion. She followed him to a room at the end of the medical corridor that had been designated as a private consultation space. Walsh closed the door, activated a small device that emitted a low electronic hum, a portable counter-surveillance jammer, and sat down across from her. "Your reports have been thorough. Meridian is satisfied with the evidence chain. We're moving to apprehension within the next 36 hours, contingent on the results of Stonewall. The operators deploying tonight don't know they're being used as bait." Walsh's expression didn't change. "The operators deploying tonight are executing a legitimate mission with legitimate objectives. The intelligence is real. The target is real. The only difference between this operation and any other is that we know which information pathway is compromised, and we've adjusted the actual execution plan accordingly. The strike team will use alternate routes and timing that were not included in the standard distribution. They will not be where the enemy expects them to be. And if the enemy adapts in real time, that's why you're deploying with them." Kira stared at him. Commander Calloway hasn't authorized me for field deployment. Commander Calloway has been briefed, partially. He knows you're operating under a classified directive, and he's agreed to attach you to the medical support element for Stonewall. You'll be positioned at the forward staging area with the quick reaction force. If things go wrong, you're the closest medical asset to the strike team. Walsh paused. And if things go very wrong, your other skills may be required. Her other skills. The ones that didn't appear in her thin, unremarkable personnel file. The ones that had been documented on a classified server and sealed behind a clearance level that didn't have a name. I haven't fired a weapon in 9 months, Kira said. Your qualification scores from your last recertification were the highest in the program. 9 months of rest hasn't changed your fundamentals. You could shoot the wings off a fly at 400 meters, and you know it. Shooting paper targets and shooting people are different things. Yes, they are. And you've done both. Walsh leaned forward. Lieutenant, I'm not going to pretend this isn't complicated. You were placed at Blackwall to identify an insider threat, and you've done that. The counterintelligence mission is effectively complete, but the operational environment has evolved, and we're in a position where the skills you brought to this assignment extend beyond investigation. If Operation Stonewall is compromised despite our precautions, there will be operators in the field who need someone capable of responding at a level that exceeds standard medical support. You're asking me to be both. I'm asking you to be what you've always been, a medic who can fight and a fighter who can heal. That's why Meridian recruited you in the first place. She sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Then she nodded. What's the loadout? Your medical kit plus a sidearm. If the tactical picture changes, we'll adjust. And after Stonewall? After Stonewall, we take Price. Quietly, cleanly, and with enough evidence to bury him. And then we find out who's on the other end of that phone. Walsh stood and deactivated the jammer. Get some rest, Lieutenant. It's going to be a long night. He left. Kira sat alone in the consultation room, running her hands through her hair and breathing slowly, the way she always did when the operational tempo shifted from investigation to action. The transition was physical. She could feel it in her body, the change from the watchful stillness of surveillance to the coiled readiness of combat preparation. Muscles she hadn't consciously engaged in months began to wake up. Her breathing dropped. Her visual field widened. She was not a nurse anymore. She hadn't been a nurse since the moment she set foot at Blackwall. But the people around her were about to find that out in real time. That evening, the task force assembled for final mission staging. Operators checked weapons, communications gear, and medical kits. Vehicles were loaded. Helicopter crews ran through their pre-flight checklists. The entire compound hummed with the controlled energy of a military unit about to cross the line from preparation to execution. Kira drew her equipment from the medical section, her trauma bag, her field kit, her communications headset. And from a locked cabinet that Walsh had authorized her to access, she drew a sidearm, an M18 pistol with 2 standard magazines. She holstered it under her vest and felt the familiar weight settle against her ribs. Maddox found her at the staging area. So you're coming with us. Medical support element, forward staging area with the QRF. He looked at the holster under her vest. Since when do nurses carry? Since tonight. Calloway signed off on this? He did. Maddox studied her face. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly, as if a question he had been carrying for days had just been answered without being asked. All right, stay close to the QRF vehicle. If things go sideways, we need you at the casualty collection point, not running into the building. Copy. He turned to leave, then stopped. Ashford, one more thing. Yeah? Whatever you really are, whatever your actual job description says, thanks for what you did for Voss. That was real. I saw it. The kid's walking because of you, and nothing else about this situation changes that. He walked away before she could respond, which was probably for the best because she wasn't sure what she would have said. Gratitude from operators was rare and always caught her off guard, no matter how many times it happened. At 0130, the strike team departed Blackwall in a convoy of armored vehicles, supported by 2 helicopters providing overwatch. Kira rode in the QRF vehicle, 4th in the column, her trauma bag between her knees and her headset tuned to the tactical frequency. The night was moonless, which was deliberate. Anvil preferred to operate on the darkest nights, when their night vision advantage over most adversaries was absolute. The target location was a warehouse complex on the outskirts of a small port town called Kelton Reach, a cluster of industrial buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing and bordered on one side by a rail yard. The trafficking network used it as a transshipment point, moving weapons components through the port and into the rail system for distribution inland. Satellite imagery showed 3 structures, 2 access roads, and a security presence consisting of 4 to 6 armed personnel. The strike team reached the staging point at 02:15 and began final preparations. Kira listened to the radio traffic as team leaders confirmed their positions, checked their sectors, and reported ready. Then, at 02:27, the first indication that something was wrong. Viper Lead, this is Overwatch 2. I'm seeing vehicle movement on the secondary access road. 2 SUVs, headlights off, approaching from the east. They're not on the pattern of life baseline. The strike team leader's voice came back immediately. Overwatch, confirm direction and speed. East to west, approximately 30 miles per hour. They'll reach the compound in under 2 minutes. A pause on the radio. Kira felt the temperature inside the vehicle drop, even though nothing had physically changed. All elements, this is Viper Lead. We may have compromise. Stand by for updated ROE. The 2 SUVs entered the compound and parked near the main warehouse. Doors opened. 6 men exited, armed with rifles, and began taking positions around the building's perimeter. They were expecting someone. The alternate routes and timing that Walsh had built into the operational plan were working. The strike team was not where the compromised intelligence said they would be, but the enemy had received enough general information to know that something was coming, and they had reinforced the target location with additional armed personnel. Price had sent it. The pipeline was confirmed, and now there were 16 operators in the field, facing a reinforced defensive position that had been pre-staged based on leaked intelligence. Viper Lead, this is Anvil Base. Director Walsh authenticates. Proceed with modified approach. Alternate breach point Bravo. Timeline accelerated. Execute in 3 mics. The strike team adjusted. That was what they did. They adapted, improvised, and executed under conditions that would paralyze anyone who hadn't been trained to treat chaos as a working environment. The breach point shifted. The assault teams repositioned. The helicopters adjusted their Overwatch orbits. At 02:34, they hit the compound. The next 8 minutes were violent, compressed, and loud. Kira listened to the radio traffic from the QRF vehicle, tracking the assault through fragmented transmissions and the distant sound of automatic weapons fire. Breach charges detonated. Flashbang grenades echoed off concrete walls. Operators called out room clearances, threat engagements, and movement through the structure in the clipped, adrenaline-compressed language of men doing the most dangerous work in the world. And then at the 0238 mark, the call she had been dreading. Viper Lead, Bravo Team. Contact. Hostile behind cover, northeast corner, elevated position. He's got a clear line on the courtyard. A second voice, sharp with urgency. Maddox is in the open. Maddox is in the courtyard. He can't see the shooter. Kira was out of the vehicle before she consciously decided to move. She grabbed her trauma bag and sprinted toward the compound perimeter, covering the 200 meters of open ground between the QRF staging point and the breach point in a time that would have surprised anyone who thought she was just a nurse carrying a medical kit. The radio crackled again. Someone take that shot. He's lining up on Maddox. I don't have the angle. I can't clear the wall from here. Kira reached the perimeter fence, went through a gap that the breach team had cut, and moved along the eastern wall of the main warehouse. She could hear the gunfire inside the building. Sharp, controlled bursts from the operators, ragged automatic fire from the defenders. The courtyard was ahead of her, a 30-meter open space between the main warehouse and a secondary storage building. She saw Maddox. He was in the courtyard, pinned behind a concrete planter that provided cover from the south, but left him completely exposed to the elevated position in the northeast corner of the secondary building. He didn't know the shooter was there. His attention was focused on a doorway to his left, where another hostile had just disappeared. And in the northeast corner, crouched behind a metal railing on a second-floor walkway, a man with a rifle was adjusting his position to take the shot. Kira dropped her trauma bag, drew her sidearm, and moved to a firing position at the corner of the warehouse wall. The angle was tight. She was shooting upward at a 40-degree elevation across 25 meters of open air, at a target partially concealed behind metal railing, with a pistol, at night, with adrenaline slamming through her bloodstream hard enough to make her hand shake if she let it. She didn't let it. She steadied her breathing. She aligned her sights. She squeezed the trigger the way she had been trained to squeeze it. Not pulling, not jerking, just a smooth, continuous application of pressure until the weapon fired. One round. The shooter dropped. His rifle clattered off the walkway and hit the courtyard floor, and the sound made Maddox spin around, weapon up, scanning for the source of the shot. His eyes found Kira standing at the corner of the warehouse with her pistol still raised, her feet planted in a shooting stance that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with thousands of hours of marksmanship training that no one at Blackwall had known she possessed. "What the—" "You're welcome," Kira said, and then she picked up her trauma bag and moved toward the courtyard because the radio was already calling for a medic and someone inside the warehouse was bleeding. The rest of the operation collapsed into the controlled chaos of a successful raid. The primary target, a logistics coordinator named Farhan, who had been managing the weapons pipeline, surrendered when the last of his security personnel were neutralized. The strike team cleared the remaining structures, secured the evidence cache, and established a perimeter for extraction. 3 operators sustained minor injuries. One took a graze across his upper arm that required field dressing but not evacuation. Another twisted his ankle during the breach and needed stabilization. The third caught a fragment from a ricochet that embedded in his vest but didn't penetrate. Kira treated all 3 at the casualty collection point, working with the team medics in a coordination that felt seamless despite the fact that she had never deployed with these men before. She started IVs, applied dressings, assessed neurological function, and documented injuries for the surgical team, all while wearing a sidearm that she had fired 30 minutes earlier to kill a man who was about to kill one of the operators she was now treating. The helicopters arrived for extraction at 0311. On the flight back to Blackwall, Kira sat in the rear of the helicopter with her trauma bag on her lap and her hands resting on her knees. She could feel the post-adrenaline crash starting, the hollow, shaky feeling that came when the body's emergency systems began to stand down, and the full weight of what had happened started to register. She had killed someone tonight. Not a paper target, not a simulation, a person. She had made the decision, taken the shot, and watched the result. It was the right call. Maddox would be dead if she hadn't fired, and she would make the same call again without hesitation. But rightness didn't erase the weight. It never did. The weight accumulated over years and deployments, and you carried it because putting it down meant pretending it didn't exist. And pretending was how operators broke. Maddox was sitting across from her in the helicopter. He hadn't spoken since the courtyard. His eyes were fixed on her, and his expression was something she couldn't quite read. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of recalibration, as if every assumption he had made about her was being disassembled and rebuilt in real time. When the helicopter landed at Blackwall and the operators filed off the ramp into the cold pre-dawn air, Maddox stopped beside her. That shot! In the courtyard. With a sidearm, at night, uphill at a target behind partial cover. I've seen guys miss that shot with a rifle and a scope. Who the hell trained you? Kira looked at him, and for the first time since arriving at Blackwall, she let something honest show on her face. Not the controlled mask, not the professional neutrality, but something real and tired and human. Ask me again after tomorrow, she said. Everything changes tomorrow. Maddox searched her face for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked away. Behind the medical section, in his quarters on the administrative wing, Nathan Price was already awake. He had monitored the operational timeline and knew the strike team had departed, but the communication he'd received back from his contact had been unusual, shorter than normal, with an urgency that suggested the information he'd provided had been acted on immediately. He didn't know the operation had succeeded. He didn't know the approach routes had been altered. He didn't know that every piece of intelligence he had transmitted had been tracked, cataloged, and preserved as evidence by a counterintelligence directorate he had never heard of. And he didn't know that in a secure room at the opposite end of the compound, Director Walsh was sitting across a table from Commander Calloway, laying out the full scope of the investigation, and that a military counterintelligence apprehension team was already being assembled at a staging base 40 minutes away, waiting for the order to move on Blackwall. Nathan Price poured himself a cup of coffee, opened his laptop, and began preparing the morning supply requisition forms. The invisible, unremarkable work of a man who had no idea that the walls were closing in from every direction, and that the quiet Navy nurse he had never thought twice about was the one who had built every inch of the cage. The cage had been built with patience, precision, and the kind of meticulous documentation that turned suspicion into prosecution. But cages only worked if the door closed before the animal realized it was standing inside one. At 0547, less than 3 hours after the strike team returned from Operation Stonewall, Director Walsh convened a meeting in the secure briefing room adjacent to the operations center. The room had been swept for electronic surveillance twice, once by Walsh's own equipment and once by a two-man technical team that had arrived at Blackwall overnight under cover of a routine communications maintenance rotation. The attendees were Walsh, Commander Calloway, and Kira Ashford. Nobody else. Walsh laid it out without preamble. Nathan Price has been transmitting classified operational intelligence to an external handler for a minimum of 9 months. Based on Lieutenant Ashford's surveillance and the facility access records provided by Commander Calloway, we have documented 11 instances of unauthorized access to the secure communications building during off-duty hours, each correlated within 72 hours of a compromised operation. During Operation Stonewall, specific details that were distributed through the standard administrative coordination pipeline, and only through that pipeline, were acted upon by hostile forces at the target location. The reinforcement element that arrived at the compound prior to the strike team's breach was positioned to interdict approach routes that appeared only in the version of the operational plan that passed through Price's section. Calloway sat with his arms folded, his face carved from something harder than stone. "You're telling me my logistics coordinator has been selling us out for 9 months, and I had a spy sitting in my medical section for 2 weeks and nobody told me about either one?" The first part is accurate. The second part was a necessary operational security measure. Lieutenant Ashford's placement was authorized at the national command level. Briefing you earlier would have risked alerting the subject. People got hurt, Walsh. Rodriguez, Park. Operations that failed because this man was feeding our playbook to the enemy. I had the authority to... You had the authority to command your unit, Commander. You did not have the authority to conduct a counterintelligence investigation. And frankly, you didn't have the information to recognize that one was necessary until Lieutenant Ashford identified the pattern. That's not a criticism. That's the nature of insider threats. They're designed to be invisible to the people closest to them. Calloway's jaw worked. He wanted to argue. Kira could see the effort it took him to swallow it, to set aside the anger and the bruised pride and focus on the operational reality. What's the timeline for apprehension? The counterintelligence team is staged 40 minutes out. They'll move on my order. We take Price during his normal duty cycle, inside his office, in a controlled environment, before he has the opportunity to destroy evidence or alert his handler. The phone in his desk drawer is the critical piece. If we get the phone intact, we get the communications history, the encryption protocols, and the contact chain on the receiving end. When? Today. 900. We let him arrive for his shift, settle into his routine, and then we close the door. Walsh turned to Kira. "Lieutenant, your role in the apprehension is observer only. You've built the evidence chain. The apprehension team handles the arrest. I need you out of the room and out of Price's line of sight when it happens." "Understood. One more thing." Walsh's expression shifted, taking on a gravity that hadn't been there before. "The intelligence community has been tracking the network on the receiving end of Price's transmissions. It's not a foreign state actor. It's a private military contracting organization called Redline Solutions, a shell company that brokers operational intelligence to the highest bidder. They don't care who buys it. Nation-states, non-state actors, criminal syndicates, anyone with the money. Price has been feeding them information about Anvil's operations, and Redline has been packaging it and selling it on a gray market that we've been trying to penetrate for 3 years." The room went quiet. The implications settled over them like fallout. This wasn't a disgruntled employee leaking information for ideological reasons. This wasn't a spy working for a hostile government with a coherent strategic objective. This was a man selling the lives of American operators for money, to a broker who then resold that information to whoever was willing to pay, with no regard for what would be done with it or who would die as a result. "How much?" Calloway's voice was flat, controlled, and carrying a cold fury that made the air in the room feel thinner. "We don't have a complete financial picture yet. The preliminary estimate, based on the transaction volume we've been able to trace, is between $300,000 and $400,000 over the 9-month period." $400,000, Calloway said each word separately, as if tasting something poisonous. That's what my people's lives were worth. That's what Price decided they were worth. The prosecution will establish the exact figure. But, Commander, I need you to hold that anger in check for the next 3 hours. If Price suspects anything at all, before 0900, we lose the phone, we lose the communications chain, and we lose Redline. The network stays active. The intelligence keeps flowing. Other units, other task forces, other operators will be compromised the same way yours were. Calloway nodded once. I'll be in my office. Normal routine, business as usual. Thank you, Commander. The meeting ended. Walsh remained behind to coordinate with the apprehension team by encrypted satellite phone. Calloway returned to his office and began his day as if nothing had changed, which required a performance of normalcy that Kira suspected was costing him more than he would ever admit. Kira walked back to the medical section through the early morning darkness, the air sharp with salt and diesel, the compound coming to life around her as the day shift began to rotate in. She passed the administrative building and saw the lights in Price's office flicker on at 0612, early as usual. A diligent employee arriving before his colleagues to get a head start on the day's work. She kept walking. The next 2 hours and 48 minutes were the longest of her career. She ran the clinic. She checked vitals on the 3 operators who had sustained minor injuries during Stonewall. She reviewed the overnight medical logs with Briggs, who had returned from his rest cycle looking marginally less exhausted. She performed a wound dressing change on Specialist Voss, who was recovering well from his surgery and had begun physical therapy on his repaired leg. "How's the pain?" she asked him, unwrapping the surgical dressing to inspect the incision site. "Manageable. The PT sessions are worse than the actual injury. That means the therapy's working. If it didn't hurt, it wouldn't be doing anything." Voss watched her work with the quiet attention of someone who had been paying attention to the stories circulating through the task force. "I heard you went out with the strike team last night." "I was with the medical support element. Standard deployment." "That's not what Maddox said." Kira finished the dressing change and noted the incision was healing cleanly. No signs of infection, good tissue granulation, appropriate swelling reduction. "Maddox talks too much." "He said you saved his life." She looked at Voss. He was 23 years old, lying in a hospital bed with a leg full of titanium, and he was looking at her with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and awe, and she didn't know what to do with either one. "I was in the right place at the right time, that's all." "Yeah, well, you were in the right place at the right time when I fell through that floor, too." "That's starting to feel like more than coincidence." She patted his shoulder and moved to the next patient. "Focus on your PT. I want you walking without crutches by the end of the month." At 0843, she received a text message on her encrypted device. One word, ready. She excused herself from the clinic, told Briggs she had a meeting at the administrative building, and walked across the compound for the last time as an undercover operative at Blackwall. The apprehension team had arrived in 2 unmarked vehicles and entered the compound through the service gate, dressed in standard military work uniforms with no identifying insignia. There were 6 of them. 4 military counterintelligence agents and 2 federal investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They assembled in an empty conference room on the ground floor of the administrative building, directly below Price's office. Walsh was there. Calloway was there. A JAG officer who had flown in overnight to ensure the legal framework of the arrest was airtight was there. The room was tense and silent in the way that rooms get when everyone present understands that the next 30 minutes will change lives permanently. At 0858, Walsh looked at the team leader and nodded. At 900, 2 agents walked up the stairs to the second floor. 2 more positioned themselves at the building's exits. The remaining 2 stayed in the conference room with the federal investigators, monitoring communications and preparing to secure the digital evidence. Kira watched from a window at the end of the first-floor corridor. She had a clear sight line to the stairwell and the second-floor landing, but she was out of the direct path and invisible to anyone looking down from Price's office. The agents reached Price's door. One knocked. "Mr. Price, we need a moment of your time." A pause. Then the door opened and Nathan Price stood there with a coffee mug in one hand and a supply requisition form in the other, looking exactly like what he appeared to be. A competent, unremarkable administrative coordinator who had no idea why 2 people he didn't recognize were standing in his doorway. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Price, we're with the Department of Defense Counterintelligence Field Activity. We need you to step away from your desk and come with us." The transformation was instantaneous and invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to see it. Price's body language didn't change. His facial expression didn't change. His voice maintained the same mild, professional tone it always had. But something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation, a rapid assessment of options, a cascade of contingency planning that happened in the fraction of a second between the moment he heard the word counterintelligence and the moment he responded. "Of course. Is this about a security review? I just completed my annual. We'll discuss the specifics downstairs. Please leave your personal belongings at your desk." "Certainly. Let me just save the document I'm working on." "Step away from the desk, Mr. Price. Now." The second agent moved into the office and positioned herself between Price and his desk. Specifically, between Price and the bottom drawer where the unauthorized phone was stored. Price's eyes tracked the movement, and in that instant, the mask slipped. Not much. Not enough for a civilian to notice. But Kira, watching from the corridor below, saw it in the way his shoulders tightened and his weight shifted onto the balls of his feet. He was thinking about running. The first agent saw it too. "Mr. Price, I'm going to ask you not to make this difficult. We're going to walk downstairs together, calmly and professionally. That's the only version of the next 5 minutes that ends well for you." Price held for 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which the entire operation balanced on the decisions of a man who had spent 19 months betraying his country and was now standing in a room with 2 people who knew it. 3 seconds during which Kira's hand moved involuntarily toward the sidearm she was still carrying under her vest. Then Price set down his coffee mug, straightened his collar, and walked out of his office with the agents flanking him. His face was composed, his stride was measured, and his hands were steady. He walked down the stairs and into the conference room, and the door closed behind him. Kira exhaled. Above her, in Price's vacated office, the evidence team was already moving in. They would secure the phone, image the computer, and catalog every document, device, and storage medium in the room. The digital forensics team would extract the communications history from the unauthorized phone within hours. And the interrogation team, a separate unit that specialized in counterintelligence debriefs, was already en route to Blackwall from Washington. The door to the cage had closed. The animal was inside. And the walls were made of evidence that he would never be able to chew through. By noon, the initial digital extraction from Price's phone had confirmed everything Kira's surveillance had established and revealed substantially more. The phone contained a dedicated encrypted messaging application that had been used to transmit operational intelligence on 37 separate occasions, far more than the 11 Kira had identified through the facility access logs. The additional transmissions had occurred during duty hours, from locations within the compound that fell outside the security camera coverage and the badge access logging system. Price had been more prolific than anyone had estimated. The communications history included detailed operational plans for 9 of the 8 compromised missions. The 9th was a mission that had been scrubbed before execution for unrelated reasons, but which would have been compromised had it proceeded. It also included the training range photographs, personnel rosters with individual operator deployment histories, the layout of Blackwall's security infrastructure including the camera blind spots and badge system limitations, and what most damning of all, a financial ledger that documented payments totaling $387,000 received through a series of cryptocurrency transactions routed through offshore accounts. The receiving end of every transmission traced back to the same destination, a server cluster operated by Redline Solutions through a chain of shell companies registered in 3 different countries. Walsh briefed Calloway on the findings at 1300 in the secure briefing room. Kira was present. 37 transmissions, Calloway repeated, his voice carrying the particular emptiness of a man who had processed so much anger that the anger itself had burned through to something colder on the other side. He was doing this 3 times a month. On average, yes, the frequency increased during periods of high operational tempo, because there was more to sell. Yes. And Redline, what's the current status on the network? The FBI and NCIS are coordinating a joint operation to dismantle Redline's domestic infrastructure. The communications chain from Price's phone has given them enough to execute search warrants on 4 locations. The international component will take longer. It involves partner intelligence agencies and extradition frameworks. But the domestic piece will be actionable within 72 hours. Calloway leaned forward. What about Price? Has he talked? Not yet. He's been read his rights under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and he's requested legal counsel. The interrogation team is prepared to begin once his attorney arrives. But frankly, Commander, the evidence is so comprehensive that his cooperation, while valuable, is not essential. We have the phone, we have the financial records, we have the transmission logs. He's done. There was a silence in the room that lasted long enough for Kira to hear the ventilation system cycling and the distant sound of helicopters on the flight line. Then Calloway said something she hadn't expected. "I want to talk to him." Walsh shook his head immediately. "That's not advisable. You're the commanding officer of the unit he compromised. Any contact between you and the subject before the legal proceedings are resolved could be construed as command influence and could jeopardize the prosecution. I'm not going to interrogate him. I'm not going to threaten him. I want to sit across from him and ask him one question." "What question?" "I want to ask him if he watched the casualty reports come in. I want to know if he read the names of the operators who were injured on missions he compromised and felt anything. Because I need to know if the man who sat in my logistics meetings and shook my hand and wished me happy birthday last March, I need to know if that person was real or if he was a character the whole time." Walsh considered this for a long moment. "I can't authorize that, Commander, but I understand why you're asking." Calloway nodded and said nothing more about it. Kira left the briefing and walked through the compound toward the medical section, and the strangeness of the moment struck her with unexpected force. The mission she had been sent to Blackwall to accomplish was effectively complete. The traitor had been identified, apprehended, and the evidence was secured. The pipeline was shut down. The network was being dismantled. By any operational metric, this was a success. But she didn't feel successful. She felt hollowed out and tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. She had spent 2 weeks pretending to be something she wasn't, inside a community she had deceived, watching people she had come to respect while carrying a secret that would have changed every interaction if they had known. Calloway's resentment about being kept in the dark wasn't misplaced. The operators who had treated her as a curiosity, then as a colleague, then as something they couldn't quite categorize, they had been manipulated too. Their perceptions managed as part of an intelligence operation they didn't know they were part of. The work was necessary. She believed that completely. But necessary and comfortable were different things, and the gap between them was where the human cost of intelligence work lived. She found Briggs in the clinic organizing the pharmacy cabinet with the methodical focus of a man who used routine tasks to avoid thinking about the things circulating through the base rumor network. "Word's spreading," he said without looking up. "People are saying someone got arrested in the admin building. Counterintelligence. The operators are losing their minds. It'll be official soon enough." Briggs stopped counting pills and turned to face her. "Is it true? Was someone leaking information?" "I can't discuss it." "Can't or won't?" "Both." He studied her for a long moment with the expression of someone who was assembling a puzzle and didn't like the picture it was forming. "You know, when you showed up here, I thought you were just another rotation nurse who'd last 3 weeks before putting in a transfer. Then you saved Voss on the range, and I thought, okay, she's better than average. Then you deployed with the strike team and apparently shot someone, and I started thinking I might not know what's going on at all." Quotes. He paused. "And now someone gets arrested the same week you started asking questions about facility access logs and personnel scheduling, and I'm starting to wonder if I've been working next to someone whose job description doesn't match the one on the door." "Briggs, I'm not asking you to tell me. I'm just saying, if you're something other than what you told me you were, I'd rather hear it from you than figure it out from the rumor mill." Kira looked at him. He was a good corpsman. Overworked, underappreciated, doing the unglamorous job of keeping a medical section functional in a unit that considered medical support an afterthought. He had been honest with her from the first day, and he deserved honesty in return. "I was sent here to investigate an insider threat," she said. "The investigation is over. I can't give you details, but what happened this morning in the admin building is connected to why I'm here." Briggs absorbed this with a slow nod. "And the nurse thing? I am a nurse. I'm also other things." "Yeah." He turned back to the pharmacy cabinet. "I kind of figured that part out on my own." The afternoon brought a development that Kira had not anticipated and that fundamentally altered the scope of what had already been a complex operation. At 14:30, the digital forensics team analyzing Price's encrypted communications discovered a message thread that had nothing to do with operational intelligence. It was a separate conversation, on the same phone, with a different contact, discussing a subject that made Walsh's face go gray when the team leader showed it to him. The thread detailed the abduction of a 19-year-old civilian named Tyler Britton, the younger brother of Sergeant First Class Drew Britton, one of Anvil's team leaders. The messages showed that Redline Solutions had orchestrated the kidnapping 6 weeks earlier as a future leverage asset. Tyler Britton had been taken from his college campus in Wentworth, a mid-sized city 300 miles inland, and was being held at a location that the messages referred to only by a coded designation. The purpose, as described in the communications, was insurance, a mechanism to ensure continued cooperation from Price, or if Price was ever compromised, a tool to coerce another insider. Tyler Britton's disappearance had been reported to local law enforcement as a missing persons case. His family had been searching for him for 6 weeks. His brother Drew had taken emergency leave from Blackwall to assist in the search, had returned 2 weeks later with no answers, and had been carrying the weight of it silently through every briefing and every mission since. Kira was in Walsh's office when the information came in. She watched the color drain from the director's face as he read the transcript, and she felt something crack inside her that had nothing to do with operational calculation. "They took a kid," she said, "a college kid, to use as leverage. That's what the communications indicate. The holding location is coded, facility November, and we don't have a geographic reference. Price may know the location, but given that he's lawyered up and not cooperating, extraction through interrogation could take days we don't have." "Why don't we have days?" Walsh pulled up a second message dated 4 days ago. This was sent from Redline to Price. It reads, "Asset viability window closing. If primary source is neutralized, asset will be liquidated per standing protocol. They're going to kill the kid if they find out Price has been arrested." Have they found out? "We don't know. Price's phone has been in our custody since 0900. If his handler expected a check-in that didn't happen, they may already be suspicious. If they have any other eyes on Blackwall, even a passive information source, they could know about the arrest. Then we're on a clock. We're on a clock. And the only lead we have is whatever we can extract from the phone data and whatever Price is willing to give us. And right now, Price isn't giving us anything." Kira's mind was already running through the options, discarding the ones that required time they didn't have, and focusing on the ones that could produce actionable intelligence within hours. "Let me talk to Drew Britton." Walsh frowned. "The brother? Why?" "Because Tyler's been missing for 6 weeks, and Drew has been looking for him that entire time. He may have information that didn't make it into the police reports. Contacts Tyler mentioned, places he'd been seen, people who were hanging around the campus before the disappearance. Things that only a family member would know. If we can cross-reference what Drew knows with the coded references in the phone data, we might be able to identify the holding location without Price's cooperation." Walsh considered it. Drew Britton doesn't know his brother's disappearance is connected to what happened here today. "Then I'll be the one to tell him." "That's going to be an extraordinarily difficult conversation." "I know." She found Sergeant First Class Drew Britton in the team room, cleaning his weapon after the previous night's operation. He was 34, compact, with deep-set eyes that carried the particular exhaustion of a man fighting on 2 fronts, one professional, one deeply personal. He looked up when Kira entered the room, and his expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and then cautious neutrality. "Ashford, or whatever your real name is." "Ashford is my real name. Can we talk privately?" He set down his weapon and followed her to an empty office down the hall. She closed the door and stood facing him, and she gave herself exactly 3 seconds to decide how to deliver what she was about to deliver. There was no good way. There never was. "Drew, what I'm about to tell you is classified, and it's going to be the hardest thing you've heard since your brother disappeared. I need you to listen to everything before you react. Can you do that?" His face changed. The neutrality evaporated, replaced by something raw and exposed and frightened. "Is Tyler dead?" "We don't believe so. We believe he's alive and being held by a private military contracting organization called Redline Solutions. His abduction was connected to the intelligence leak inside this task force, the same leak that was shut down this morning." Drew stared at her. The processing took time. She could see it happening behind his eyes, the connections forming, the implications cascading. His brother's disappearance, the compromised operations, the arrest in the administrative building, the nurse who wasn't a nurse. "Price." The name came out like a blade. "Price did this. Price was the intelligence source. Redline orchestrated the kidnapping independently as a contingency measure. We found the communications on Price's phone. They reference a holding location using a coded designation, Facility November, and we're working to identify the geographic location. I'll kill him. Drew's voice was barely above a whisper, but the intensity behind it was physical, radiating from his body like heat from metal. I'll walk into whatever room he's in, and I'll kill him with my hands. No, you won't, because that doesn't get Tyler back, and getting Tyler back is the only thing that matters right now. She let that land. Drew, I need your help. You spent 2 weeks looking for Tyler before you came back to Blackwall. I need everything you have, every lead, every tip, every contact, every detail that might help us identify where Redline is holding him. Anything that didn't make it into the police report. Anything you thought was insignificant but stuck with you anyway. Drew's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the collision of rage and hope and desperation that happened when a man who had been living with the worst kind of uncertainty was suddenly told that the answer was close but not yet in reach. He took a breath, then another. Then he sat down and started talking. The next 90 minutes were the most productive intelligence gathering session Kira had conducted since arriving at Blackwall. Drew Britton was a trained special operations soldier with an excellent memory and a personal motivation that made his recall sharper than any formal debriefing could produce. He walked her through everything: Tyler's daily patterns on campus, the friends he had mentioned, the part-time job at a shipping logistics company near the waterfront, the car that Tyler had reported following him 3 days before he disappeared, the text messages Tyler had sent in the week before the abduction. One detail caught Kira's attention immediately. You said Tyler worked at a shipping logistics company. What was the name? Ridgepoint Logistics, warehouse operation near the Wentworth Port District. And Tyler mentioned that new management had taken over about 2 months before he disappeared? Yeah, he said the vibe changed. New security protocols, restricted areas he wasn't allowed to enter. He thought they were handling something they didn't want the regular employees to see. Kira pulled up the Redline Solutions corporate structure on Walsh's secured intelligence terminal. The shell company network included a list of subsidiary operations, each registered under different corporate identities but linked through shared financial infrastructure. The fourth entry on the list was a company called Ridgepoint Logistics LLC, registered in the same state as Tyler Britton's college town, with a warehouse address in the Wentworth Port District. Drew. Yeah, Ridgepoint Logistics is a Redline front company. The color left his face. Tyler was working inside their operation. He didn't know it, but he was already inside. Which means they didn't abduct him from campus. They recruited him as an unwitting employee, realized he was the brother of a special operations soldier assigned to the unit they were already compromising, and then took him when they decided he was more valuable as leverage than as a warehouse worker. And they're probably holding him at the same facility he was already working at, or somewhere connected to it. Kira was already transmitting the information to Walsh. The Ridgepoint Logistics warehouse in Wentworth had a physical address, a corporate filing that included the property dimensions and lease terms, and critically, satellite imagery that could be pulled within minutes through the intelligence community's surveillance architecture. Walsh moved fast. Within 30 minutes, he had a satellite pass scheduled over the Wentworth Port District. Within 45 minutes, the imagery was on his screen, showing a warehouse complex that matched the Ridgepoint Logistics address, a cluster of 3 buildings surrounded by a perimeter fence with controlled vehicle access, loading docks on the south side, and a smaller annex building on the northeast corner that had blacked-out windows and a separate security perimeter. The annex. That's a holding facility, Walsh said, pointing to the annex on the imagery. Separate security perimeter, opaque windows, single access point. If they're keeping Tyler Britton anywhere in this complex, it's there. How fast can we get a team on the ground? Kira asked. This is domestic soil. We can't deploy a military strike team to a location inside the United States without invoking authorities that take time and create legal exposure. This needs to go through FBI hostage rescue. HRT deployment from Quantico to Wentworth is 4 to 5 hours minimum, plus planning, plus coordination with local law enforcement. That's half a day we might not have. I'm aware of the timeline, Lieutenant. Then let me go. Walsh looked at her. Excuse me? I can be in Wentworth in 3 hours by helicopter. I don't need a strike team. I need to get eyes on that facility. Confirm Tyler's presence and hold the position until HRT arrives. Reconnaissance and assessment only. If the situation deteriorates before the cavalry shows up, I'm qualified to act. You're one person. One person who can move faster and with a lower signature than a 12-man tactical unit deploying across 300 miles of airspace. If Redline has any early warning capability, they'll see HRT coming. They won't see me. Walsh rubbed his face with both hands. He looked at Calloway, who had entered the briefing room during the intelligence review and had been standing against the wall in silence, listening to everything. Commander, your input. Calloway looked at Kira. Ashford, what you're proposing is a solo reconnaissance operation on domestic soil, targeting a facility operated by a hostile intelligence network that has already demonstrated willingness to kidnap, coerce, and potentially kill. You'd be operating without backup, without a quick reaction force, and without legal authority to use force unless you can establish an imminent threat to life. Yes, sir. And you want to do this anyway. There's a 19-year-old kid in that building, Commander. His brother is down the hall, and he's been looking for him for 6 weeks, and if we wait for the bureaucracy to catch up with the situation, Tyler Britton might not be alive when it gets there. Calloway and Walsh exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Risk assessments, legal liabilities, chain of command implications, and the fundamental tension between doing things right and doing them in time. I'll authorize the helicopter, Calloway said. Walsh, coordinate with FBI HRT and get them moving. Ashford gets a 3-hour head start for reconnaissance. If she confirms the hostage is present, HRT takes over the tactical operation. If the situation changes before they arrive, he paused and looked at Kira with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something that might have been trust. Use your judgment. Yes, sir. And Ashford, bring the kid home. She was airborne within 40 minutes. The helicopter flew south-southwest at maximum cruise speed, crossing 300 miles of coastline, farmland, and suburban sprawl in 2 hours and 37 minutes. Kira sat in the rear cabin with her trauma bag, her sidearm, a tactical radio linked to Walsh's command frequency, and a tablet displaying the satellite imagery of the Ridgepoint Logistics Complex. She studied the layout during the flight, memorizing approach routes, sight lines, cover positions, and the security perimeter around the annex building. The complex was located in an industrial zone near the Wentworth waterfront, a district of warehouses, rail sidings, and commercial docks that would be sparsely populated after business hours. If she arrived before dark, she could establish an observation position and assess the security presence before making any approach. Drew Britton had wanted to come. Walsh had denied the request, and Kira had agreed with the decision, even though it cost her something to look Drew in the eye and tell him that his participation in the rescue of his own brother would compromise the operation. He was too close, too emotional, too likely to make a decision based on love rather than tactics. She told him she would bring Tyler home. She meant it, but meaning something and guaranteeing it were different things, and she knew that better than most. The helicopter set down at a municipal airfield 6 miles from the Wentworth Port District at 1747. A Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives vehicle, coordinated through Walsh's interagency contacts, was waiting on the tarmac. Kira transferred her equipment, changed into civilian clothes, and drove to the industrial district through surface streets that she navigated using the satellite imagery she had memorized during the flight. She reached the perimeter of the Ridgepoint Logistics Complex at 1823, parked the vehicle in a loading area behind an adjacent warehouse, and moved on foot to an observation position on the second floor of a derelict commercial building 200 meters east of the target. The complex looked different at ground level than it had from satellite. The 3 main warehouse buildings were operational, loading docks active, vehicles moving, workers visible through open bay doors. The perimeter fence was chain link with barbed wire, standard for an industrial facility. Nothing that screamed covert military operation. But the annex was different. The annex building sat behind a secondary fence that was heavier than the main perimeter. Solid panels rather than chain link, topped with razor wire rather than barbed wire. The blacked-out windows she had identified on satellite were visible from her position, and she could see a security camera mounted on each corner of the building, covering all 4 approaches. There was a single access gate in the secondary fence, and as she watched, a man in dark clothing emerged from the annex, walked to a vehicle parked inside the secondary perimeter, retrieved a bag, and returned inside. He was carrying a sidearm in a hip holster, not a security guard's holster, a tactical rig, the kind used by private military contractors. Kira counted the vehicles inside the secondary perimeter. 3. 2 SUVs and a cargo van. She noted the license plates, transmitted them to Walsh through her tactical radio, and settled in to wait. Over the next hour, she observed the annex and documented everything. 2 additional armed personnel were visible through brief appearances at the access gate. The security cameras rotated on a 30-second cycle. The access gate was electronically controlled, badge or keypad entry. There were no visible windows on the ground floor. The blacked-out windows were on the second floor only. The building appeared to have a single entrance on the south side and a potential emergency exit on the north side that was partially obscured by stacked shipping containers. At 1937, Walsh's voice came through her radio. Ashford, FBI HRT is en route. ETA to staging area is 3 hours, 20 minutes. They'll establish a tactical operations center at the municipal airfield and coordinate final approach with you. Copy. I've got 3 armed personnel confirmed, possibly more inside. The annex is a hardened facility with electronic access control and camera coverage. This isn't a casual setup. They've been operating here for a while. Understood. Any indication of the hostage? Not yet. I can't see inside from this distance. I need to move closer. Negative on that, Ashford. Hold position and observe. HRT will handle the approach. Walsh, if they're monitoring Price's communication pattern and he's missed a scheduled check-in, they could already be moving to liquidate. 3 hours is hold position. That's an order. She held position. For 43 minutes, she held position and watched the annex through the fading daylight, counting camera cycles and personnel movements and calculating approach angles that she had been explicitly told not to use. At 2020, the cargo van inside the secondary perimeter started its engine. Its headlights came on. The access gate opened, and through the momentary gap in the gate, illuminated by the van's headlights, Kira saw something that made her blood freeze. A figure was being walked from the annex's south entrance toward the van. The figure was moving slowly, unsteadily, supported on each side by armed personnel. The figure's head was covered with a hood. The figure's hands were bound in front. The figure was small, young. The build matched Tyler Britton's description. They were moving him. Kira keyed her radio. Walsh, they're extracting the hostage. Cargo van is preparing to depart the facility. If that van leaves the complex, we lose him. 3 seconds of silence. Then Walsh's voice, tight and controlled. Ashford, HRT is still 2 hours and 40 minutes out. You are not authorized to... Walsh, they are putting a hooded, bound hostage into a van. If I let that van drive away, Tyler Britton is dead. You know it, and I know it. The silence on the radio stretched for 5 seconds, 7 seconds, 10. Then Walsh said 2 words that she would remember for the rest of her career. Your judgment. Kira dropped the radio into her vest pocket, drew her sidearm, and moved toward the annex. She moved toward the annex the way water moves through cracks, finding the path of least resistance, filling the spaces between obstacles, flowing around the things she couldn't go through. The 200 meters between her observation position and the secondary perimeter took her 90 seconds. She crossed open ground using the stacked shipping containers and parked vehicles as cover, timing her movement to the 30-second camera rotation cycles she had mapped during her observation period. The cargo van's engine was still running. Its headlights cut 2 beams across the pavement inside the secondary fence. Through the gap in the access gate, she could see the 2 armed personnel loading the hooded figure into the rear of the van. One of them gripped the figure's arm roughly, shoving rather than guiding, and the figure stumbled and nearly fell. A muffled sound came from under the hood. Not a scream, not words, just the compressed noise of someone who had been hooded and bound long enough to have stopped trying to communicate and was now producing sound involuntarily, the way a body protests when it's handled with force. Kira reached the secondary fence and moved along its eastern edge, staying below the camera's field of view. The solid panels gave her concealment, but also blocked her sightline. She needed to get inside the perimeter before the van moved. The emergency exit on the north side, the one partially obscured by shipping containers. She had noted it during her observation. A metal door, probably alarmed, but the containers stacked against the building's north wall created a gap between the fence and the structure that was too narrow for a vehicle but wide enough for a person. She found the gap. It was tight, 18 inches between the fence panel and a corrugated metal container, and she turned sideways and pushed through, feeling the rough metal edge catch her jacket and tear it at the shoulder. She emerged inside the secondary perimeter, behind the container stack, out of the camera's coverage arc and 10 meters from the north side door. The door was steel, windowless, with an exterior handle and no visible electronic lock. She tested the handle. It turned. The door was unlocked, an emergency exit designed to open from the inside, but someone had disabled the exterior lockout, probably for convenience. She opened it 6 inches, listened, heard nothing from the immediate interior, and slipped inside. The north corridor of the annex was dark, lit only by a single emergency exit sign above the door she had just entered. The air smelled like industrial cleaning chemicals and stale food. The floor was poured concrete. The walls were unpainted drywall, the kind of hasty interior construction that turned a commercial warehouse into a functional space without any pretense of permanence. She could hear the van's engine through the south wall. Voices, muffled, clipped, professional. The personnel loading the hostage were wrapping up. Kira moved down the corridor toward the south side of the building, her sidearm in a two-handed grip, her breathing controlled, every step placed deliberately to minimize sound on the concrete floor. She passed 2 doors on her left, both closed, both dark beneath the frames. A third door on her right was open, and she cleared it with a quick visual sweep. Empty room, folding table, 2 chairs, a water bottle, zip ties on the floor. An interrogation space, recently vacated. The corridor turned left and opened into a larger space, a central room that appeared to serve as the main operational area for the annex. Kira stopped at the corner and assessed. 3 men. 2 of them were near the south entrance, visible through the open bay door that led to the area where the van was parked. They were the ones she had seen loading the hostage. Both armed. Holstered pistols, no long guns visible. The third man was standing at a folding table near the center of the room, packing documents and a laptop into a hard-sided case with the urgency of someone executing a pre-planned evacuation protocol. The hostage was already in the van. She could see the van's rear doors closing through the bay entrance. 3 hostiles, 1 sidearm, no backup for at least 2 hours. She ran the calculation the way she had been trained to run it, not as a mathematical equation, but as a fluid assessment of angles, distances, cover positions, threat levels, and the probability of achieving the objective without getting herself or the hostage killed. The 2 men near the bay door were 6 meters from her position. The third was 8 meters, partially screened by the table. If she engaged, she needed to neutralize all 3 before any of them could reach the van and use the hostage as a shield or drive away. She couldn't do it. Not from this position, not with a pistol, not against 3 armed targets simultaneously. The geometry didn't work. Even if she dropped the first 2 before they could react, the third had enough time to reach the van. She needed a different approach. The man at the table finished packing the case and called toward the bay door. "Vehicles ready?" "Ready. We need to go. Comms window closes in 20 minutes. "What about the upstairs?" "Wiped. Nothing left. We can burn it on the way out if you want." "Not worth the attention. Let's move." 20 minutes. They had a communications window, a scheduled check-in or data transmission that they needed to complete from a different location. That meant the van wasn't going far, at least initially. It also meant they were operating on a clock, which made them hurried and potentially careless. The 2 men near the bay door walked out toward the van. The third man picked up his case and followed, reaching for a light switch near the bay entrance. Kira moved. She came out of the corridor fast and low, closing the distance to the bay door as the third man's back was turned. He was reaching for the switch, his right hand occupied with the case, his left hand extended toward the wall. She was behind him in 4 strides. She pressed the muzzle of her sidearm against the base of his skull. "Don't move. Don't speak. Set the case down." He froze. The case lowered to the floor with a tremor that she felt through the weapon's contact point. "Where's the hostage?" "In the van." His voice was controlled but strained, a professional under duress. "Who are you?" "Move forward. Slowly. Toward the van. You're going to tell your 2 associates that you forgot something inside and they need to come back. If you say anything else, Anything at all. I will shoot you. Nod if you understand. He nodded. They moved through the bay door into the loading area. The van was 10 meters ahead, engine idling, rear doors closed. The two other men were standing near the driver's side, one already reaching for the door handle. "Hey," the man in front of Kira called. His voice was almost steady. "Left my secondary phone upstairs. Need a hand checking." The man nearest the driver's door turned, saw Kira standing behind his colleague with a weapon pressed against his head, and went for his holster. Kira shoved the man in front of her to the left, dropped to a knee, and fired twice. The first round hit the man reaching for his weapon in the right shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second hit the van's front tire, the heavy round punching through the sidewall with a hiss of escaping air. The third man, the one who had been on the passenger side, ducked behind the van's engine block and drew his weapon. "Federal authority! Drop your weapon and get on the ground!" Kira shouted. Because even though she wasn't FBI and didn't technically have federal arrest authority, the words created a moment of uncertainty. Uncertainty was hesitation. Hesitation was time. The man behind the van's engine block didn't fire. He was calculating the same thing she was. Angles, odds, the risk of hitting the hostage in the back of the van if rounds started traveling through sheet metal. "There's a tactical team inbound," Kira said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who was telling the truth. "They'll be here in under an hour. You can walk away from this with a weapons charge, or you can die behind that van. Choose." The man she had shoved was on the ground, disoriented but not incapacitated. She stepped on his weapon hand as she moved past him, pinning it to the pavement. "Last chance." The man behind the engine block held for 3 more seconds. Then his weapon clattered onto the concrete, and his hands appeared above the van's hood. "On the ground, face down, hands behind your head." He complied. The man with the shoulder wound was sitting against the van's rear wheel, his hand pressed against the entry point, blood running between his fingers. He made no move for his weapon, which had fallen 2 meters away. Kira kicked all 3 weapons out of reach, zip-tied the 2 uninjured men using the restraints she had found in the interrogation room, and applied a field dressing to the wounded man's shoulder with the detached efficiency of someone whose body could perform medical procedures on autopilot, while her mind focused on the tactical situation. Then she went to the van's rear doors and opened them. Tyler Britton was lying on his side on the bare metal floor of the cargo area, hooded, hands bound with zip ties, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt that were stained and wrinkled from weeks of captivity. He flinched when the doors opened, curling inward, and the sound he made was small and frightened and exactly the kind of sound that made Kira's chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. "Tyler, my name is Kira. I'm with the United States military. Your brother Drew sent me. You're safe." She removed the hood. The face underneath was pale, gaunt, streaked with grime. His eyes were swollen and watering from the sudden exposure to light after what had clearly been extended periods of darkness. He was dehydrated. She could see it in the cracked lips and sunken skin, and his wrists were raw and bleeding under the zip ties. She cut the ties with a knife from her vest and helped him sit up. "Drew?" His voice was hoarse, barely functional. "Drew's okay?" "Drew is fine. He's been looking for you. He never stopped looking for you." Tyler's face crumpled. Not dramatic sobbing, the quiet, broken disintegration of someone who had spent 6 weeks in captivity, not knowing if anyone was coming and had just been told that someone had been coming the entire time. Kira helped him out of the van, sat him against the wall of the annex, wrapped a thermal blanket from her trauma bag around his shoulders, and started an IV for fluid replacement. His vitals were poor but stable. Low blood pressure, elevated heart rate, mild hypothermia, probable malnutrition. Nothing immediately life-threatening. He would need a full medical evaluation and likely several days of inpatient care, but he was going to survive. She keyed her radio. "Walsh, hostage is recovered. Tyler Britton is alive, conscious, and stable. 3 hostiles neutralized, 1 GSW to the right shoulder, 2 restrained, all weapons secured. Facility is under my control. Send HRT to the Ridgepoint Logistics Annex for evidence recovery and prisoner transfer." Walsh's response came back in 4 seconds. "Copy all, Ashford. HRT is redirecting to your position. ETA 94 minutes. Outstanding work." Kira sat down next to Tyler Britton against the annex wall and allowed herself 30 seconds of stillness. The adrenaline was still circulating. Her hands were starting to shake with the fine tremor that followed sustained high-stress performance, and the wound in her shoulder where the fence had torn her jacket was bleeding lightly. She hadn't noticed until now. Tyler was staring at the three restrained men with an expression she recognized. Not anger, not relief. The bewildered disbelief of someone who had been treated as an object for weeks and was still processing the fact that the people who had done it were now lying on the ground in zip ties. "Why?" he asked. "Why did they take me?" "Because your brother is a soldier, and someone decided you were useful as a tool to control people around him. It had nothing to do with who you are. It had everything to do with what you were worth to them." "How much was I worth?" She looked at him. He was 19 years old, sitting on cold concrete with an IV in his arm and raw wrists, asking how much his life had been valued at by the people who had stolen it. "You're worth everything to your brother," she said. "That's the only number that matters." HRT arrived 87 minutes later. The tactical team secured the facility, processed the evidence, and transferred the three Red Line operatives to federal custody. The wounded man was evacuated to a civilian hospital under armed guard. Tyler Britton was transported by military helicopter to Blackwall, where a full medical team, assembled by Briggs, who had been told nothing about the operation but had somehow anticipated the need, was waiting on the landing pad. Drew Britton was standing behind the medical team. When Tyler came off of the helicopter, wrapped in the thermal blanket, walking on his own but leaning on Kira's arm, Drew took 3 steps forward and stopped. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He stood there, and his face did something that Kira had seen on battlefields and in hospitals, and in all the places where people collided with the limits of what they could endure. It simply broke open, all the control and discipline and composure falling away at once, leaving nothing but a man looking at his little brother. Tyler saw him and said, "Drew." And that was the last word either of them managed for a long time. Kira stepped away and let them have the moment. She walked across the landing pad toward the medical section, carrying her trauma bag and her sidearm and the weight of everything that had happened in the last 8 hours. She was halfway there when Commander Calloway intercepted her. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "I've been commanding special operations teams for 14 years. I've seen men with silver stars and combat valor awards. I've served with the best operators this country produces." He paused. "What you did tonight, alone, with a pistol, against 3 armed hostiles in a facility you'd never entered, I don't have a word for it. I had good intelligence and a narrow window. It wasn't heroics, it was math." "It wasn't math, Ashford. Don't reduce it." He straightened. "Director Walsh is convening a full operational debrief at 0800 tomorrow. After that, there are going to be conversations about what happens next, with Price, with Red Line, with the families of every operator who was affected by the compromised missions. I want you in the room for all of it." "Yes, sir." "And Ashford, Kira." It was the first time he had used her first name. "Whatever I said to you on your first day here, whatever I thought about you, whatever assumptions I made, I was wrong, completely and entirely wrong. And I'm not a man who says that easily." She nodded, because words felt inadequate and because the fatigue was starting to win the war against adrenaline. The debrief the next morning lasted 4 hours. Walsh led it, walking through the complete scope of the investigation from Meridian's initial intelligence assessment through Kira's placement at Blackwall, the surveillance operation, the Stonewall deception, Price's arrest, the discovery of Tyler Britton's abduction, and the rescue operation at the Ridgepoint Logistics Annex. The room contained Calloway, his executive officer, the task force's senior team leaders, including Drew Britton, who had refused to be excused despite Walsh's recommendation, and the NCIS investigators who would be leading the prosecution. The evidence against Nathan Price was laid out in its entirety. 37 transmissions, 9 compromised operations, $387,000 in payments, the kidnapping of a civilian to be used as leverage, the communications trail linking every transmission to Red Line Solutions. The NCIS lead investigator, a senior agent named Torres, outlined the charges. Nathan Price will be charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and federal statute with espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized disclosure of classified national defense information, conspiracy to kidnap, accessory to kidnapping, and computer fraud. The espionage charges alone carry a maximum sentence of life without parole. Given the scope of the damage, compromised operations resulting in injuries to military personnel, the kidnapping of a civilian, and the systematic sale of classified intelligence to a commercial broker. The prosecution will seek the maximum penalty on all counts. What about Redline? Calloway asked. The FBI executed search warrants on 4 Redline Solutions facilities yesterday. 3 individuals have been arrested, including the company's principal operator, a former intelligence contractor named Silas Drummond. Additional arrests are pending. The international component, Redline's offshore financial infrastructure and foreign client relationships, is being pursued through partner intelligence agencies. The network is effectively dismantled on the domestic side. And the foreign clients? The people who actually use the intelligence Price sold? Torres hesitated. That's a longer timeline, Commander. Some of those clients are in countries where we don't have extradition agreements. The intelligence community will continue to work those targets, but I won't promise you a clean resolution on that front. Calloway nodded. He hadn't expected a clean resolution. Clean resolutions didn't exist in this world. But the core of the rot had been cut out, and the people most directly responsible were in custody facing charges that would ensure they never operated again. After the debrief, Walsh pulled Kira aside. Meridian is closing the file on the Blackwall operation. You'll receive a formal commendation through classified channels. Nothing public. Nothing that appears in your standard service record. That's standard protocol for Meridian operatives. I know the protocol. There's something else. Commander Calloway has submitted a request through Naval Medical Command to retain you at Blackwall as a permanent member of Task Force Anvil's medical support element. Not as a cover, as an actual assignment. Kira stared at him. He wants me to stay? He's seen what you can do, both sides of it, the medical expertise and the operational capability. He told me, and I'm paraphrasing, that he'd rather have you inside his unit voluntarily than have Meridian plant someone else he doesn't know about. That's not how Meridian works. No. But it's how Calloway works, and given what this unit has been through, I think there's value in having someone here who understands both the intelligence side and the operational side. Walsh paused. The assignment is yours if you want it. Real orders, real position, real role. No cover, no classified objectives. Just a medic with a very unusual skill set serving with a task force that could use exactly that. She didn't answer immediately. She looked through the window toward the compound, where operators were moving through their routines, where Briggs was probably restocking the pharmacy cabinet, where Drew Britton was sitting with his brother in the recovery ward, and where the empty office that had belonged to Nathan Price was being stripped of every piece of equipment and furniture, erased from the building as thoroughly as the man himself was being erased from the unit's operational history. I'll think about it, she said. Take your time. The offer stays open. That afternoon, Kira went to the recovery ward to check on Tyler Britton's medical status. His labs showed moderate dehydration and caloric deficit consistent with 6 weeks of inadequate nutrition, but no organ damage, no signs of physical torture beyond the wrist abrasions, and no indications of serious psychological breakdown, though the psychological evaluation would take weeks to complete, and the full impact of his captivity wouldn't be understood for months. Drew was sitting beside his brother's bed, looking like a man who had been disassembled and put back together with some of the pieces in different places than before. "Thank you," he said when Kira walked in. The words were simple, and they carried the weight of everything he couldn't say. "How's he doing?" "He's sleeping. First real sleep in 6 weeks," the doc said. His body just shut down once he felt safe. Kira checked the IV drip rate and reviewed the chart. Everything was tracking. Tyler would recover physically. The rest would take longer and would require support that went beyond what a military medical facility could provide. Drew, when he wakes up, he's going to need someone to be normal with him. Not a debrief, not an interrogation, not a clinical assessment, just his brother, talking about regular things. Can you do that? Yeah, I can do that. She started to leave. Drew's voice stopped her at the doorway. Ashford, the guys, the team. They're talking about what happened. Not just the rescue. All of it. The investigation, Price, the operations that were compromised. Some of them are angry, some of them are processing. But all of them, every single one, they know what you did. And they know that none of it would have come out if you hadn't been here. She stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and felt the weight of those words settle into a place she didn't usually let things reach. I was just doing my job, Drew. No. You were doing everyone's job, and you did it alone, and nobody thanked you while it was happening, and most of us treated you like garbage while you were saving our lives. He paused. That won't happen again. She nodded and walked out, and the hallway was quiet and empty, and she kept walking until she reached the exterior door, and she stepped out into the cold coastal air and stood there, breathing, letting the wind off Thornfield Harbor carry away the accumulated tension of 2 weeks, 12 days, one investigation, one raid, one rescue, and one shot fired in a dark courtyard that had changed everything. And standing there, she made a decision. She pulled out her encrypted device and composed a message to Meridian's operational command, requesting reassignment to permanent duty. Station, Blackwall Military Medical Center. Task Force Anvil Medical Support Element. Accept Commander Calloway's retention request. Ashford out. The response came in 11 seconds. Acknowledged. Orders to follow. Well done, Lieutenant. She deleted both messages, pocketed the device, and walked back inside. Tomorrow morning, there would be a formation. The task force would assemble, and Commander Calloway would address them about what had happened, the betrayal, the investigation, the arrest, the rescue. The full truth, or as much of it as security protocols allowed. And somewhere in that formation, Kira Ashford would stand among the operators she had been sent to spy on, and they would see her not as the nurse they had mocked, not as the spy they hadn't detected, but as the person who had uncovered the threat, saved the hostage, protected the unit, and chosen to stay. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, in a federal detention facility 300 miles from Blackwall, Nathan Price sat in an interrogation room across from NCIS Agent Torres, and after 14 hours of silence, he finally opened his mouth. "I want a deal." Torres leaned back in his chair. "You're facing espionage charges with a maximum penalty of life without parole. What could you possibly offer that's worth a deal?" Price's eyes were flat, empty of everything except the particular desperation of a man who had run out of room to maneuver and was reaching for the only card he had left. Redline's client list. Every buyer, every government, every organization, every individual who purchased intelligence through the network. Names, dates, transaction records. I memorized them. All of them. Drummond kept a master ledger, but I kept my own copy. Up here. He tapped his temple. 31 clients across 14 countries. Some of them are people your intelligence community has been hunting for years. Torres kept his face neutral, but his hand reached for his phone under the table. "And there's one more thing," Price said, leaning forward. "One of Redline's clients isn't foreign. One of them is inside the Department of Defense, senior level. Someone who's been buying Anvil's operational data not to sell it again, but to bury it, to make sure certain operations fail because the targets are people this official is protecting." He paused, watching Torres's face for the reaction. "You arrested me, Agent Torres, but I'm not the biggest problem you have. I'm not even close." Torres stared at him for a long time. Then he picked up his phone, stepped out of the room, and dialed Director Walsh's direct line. In her quarters at Blackwall, Kira Ashford was asleep for the first time in 31 hours. And she didn't hear the phone ring. And she didn't know that the case she thought was closed had just cracked wide open in a direction nobody had anticipated, and that by morning, everything she believed about the scope of this investigation was going to change. The change came at 0438, when Walsh's voice cut through the darkness of her quarters like a blade through cloth. "Ashford, wake up. We have a problem." Kira was vertical before her eyes fully opened, a reflex built over years of deployments where the difference between sleeping and operating was measured in heartbeats, not minutes. Walsh was standing in her doorway, his face lit by the blue glow of his phone screen, and the expression he wore was one she had never seen on him before. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't urgency. It was the particular stillness of a man recalculating the size of the thing he was standing in front of. "Price is talking," Walsh said. "He's offering Redline's full client list in exchange for a reduced sentence. 31 buyers across 14 countries." "That's good. That's what we wanted." "One of the buyers is inside the Department of Defense." Kira's fatigue vanished. She stood in the cold room, barefoot on concrete, and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with physical movement. "How senior?" Price claims the individual holds a position with oversight authority over special operations intelligence dissemination. Someone with the power to influence which operations succeed and which ones fail. Not by leaking information externally, but by selectively degrading the intelligence packages before they reach the field. He says this person has been purchasing Anvil's operational data from Redline not to resell it, but to ensure that specific targets are never successfully captured. Protected targets. That's the implication. Targets who are more valuable alive and operating than they would be in custody. Someone inside the Pentagon has been using Redline as a back channel to sabotage operations against individuals they want to keep in play. Kira sat on the edge of her rack and pressed her palms against her knees. The scope of this had just expanded from a single insider threat at a single military installation to a corruption case that reached into the senior levels of the defense establishment. The kind of case that destroyed careers, ended administrations, and consumed years of investigative resources. Does Price have a name? He says he does. He's conditioning the release of the name on a formal plea agreement with sentencing concessions. NCIS and the FBI are negotiating the terms now. Torres estimates we'll have the identity within 12 hours. 12 hours is a long time if this person has any indication that Price is cooperating. Agreed, which is why I'm activating a compartmented investigation through Meridian's Washington office. We're going to identify this individual through independent means, financial records, communications intercepts, access pattern analysis, and we're going to do it before Price's plea deal is finalized. If we can develop the case independently, Price's cooperation becomes corroborating evidence rather than the foundation of the prosecution. That makes the case stronger and takes the leverage out of his hands. But what do you need from me? Right now, nothing. This moves to Washington. The Blackwall operation is closed. But I wanted you to know because the people in this unit, the operators whose missions were compromised, they deserve to know that the accountability doesn't stop with Price. It goes higher. And when it lands, it's going to land hard. Walsh left. Kira sat in the dark for a long time, turning the information over and examining it from every angle. Then she showered, dressed, and walked to the clinic to begin her shift, because the work didn't stop for revelations, and the patients didn't care about the internal mechanics of federal investigations. The next 72 hours moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. At Blackwall, life returned to something resembling normal operations. The task force resumed training cycles. Operational planning continued through a newly restructured intelligence dissemination pathway that eliminated the administrative coordination access point Price had exploited. Commander Calloway conducted individual meetings with every team leader, acknowledging the breach, outlining the corrective measures, and answering questions with a directness that cost him visibly, but earned him something more valuable than comfort. It earned him the trust of people who had been betrayed and needed to know their commander was capable of facing that betrayal honestly. Kira worked the clinic. She treated the routine injuries and ailments that constituted the daily medical reality of a military installation. She continued overseeing Specialist Voss's physical therapy, noting with professional satisfaction and personal relief that his range of motion was improving ahead of schedule. She checked on Tyler Britton, who was recovering in the base medical ward under Drew's near-constant supervision, eating solid food again and beginning to talk, haltingly, in fragments, about what had happened to him during the 6 weeks of captivity. She also began the quiet, unglamorous process of integrating into a unit that was still figuring out what to do with her. The operator's reaction to her presence had shifted, but it hadn't settled. Some of them, Maddox, Drew, a few of the younger team members, treated her with a respect that bordered on deference, which made her uncomfortable. Others maintained a cautious distance, not hostile, but uncertain, still processing the fact that they had spent 2 weeks working alongside an undercover counterintelligence operative and hadn't known it. And a few, Master Sergeant Holt among them, struggled with something more complex, the intersection of gratitude for what she had done and resentment about how she had done it. Holt found her in the clinic on the second day after the debrief. "I owe you an apology," he said, standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides, looking like a man submitting to a dental procedure. "The things I said when you first got here, the way I acted, I was out of line. You were testing me. That's what operators do with outsiders. I didn't take it personally. Maybe you should have. I was wrong about you, and not in a small way. I was wrong in every way it's possible to be wrong about a person." Kira looked at him. She could have been gracious. She could have dismissed it, made it easy for him, offered the social lubrication that smoothed over uncomfortable moments between colleagues. But she respected Holt too much for that, and she respected herself too much to pretend the experience hadn't mattered.
Yeah,
she said. You were. And it's not the first time someone has looked at me and seen a label instead of a person. It probably won't be the last. But here's what I need you to understand, Holt. I wasn't offended by it. I was disappointed. Because the men and women in this unit are supposed to be the best at reading situations and assessing threats. And every single one of you looked at a Navy nurse and stopped looking. You saw the rank, the insignia, the medical badge, and you decided you knew the whole story. In our line of work, that kind of assumption gets people killed. Holt absorbed this without flinching, which she respected. Fair, he said, completely fair. We're good, Holt. Move forward. He nodded and left. And Kira returned to her inventory count with the private, complicated knowledge that the conversation she had just had was one she had been having in different forms for her entire career, with instructors who didn't think she belonged in sniper qualification, with commanding officers who couldn't reconcile her medical credentials with her tactical skills, with colleagues who needed her to fit into a category before they could accept her as a peer. She had stopped fitting into categories a long time ago, and the discomfort that caused other people was not her responsibility to manage. On the third day, Walsh called from Washington. We have a name. Independent corroboration through financial records and communications analysis, separate from Price's plea negotiation. The individual inside the Department of Defense who is purchasing Anvil's operational data through Redline is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Operations Policy, Martin Aldrich. Kira recognized the title, if not the man. The Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Operations Policy sat in the civilian oversight chain above every Special Operations task force in the military. The position had direct access to operational planning summaries, intelligence assessments, and target packages for every active mission across all service branches. It was, by design, one of the most sensitive positions in the defense establishment, a civilian appointee with visibility into the military's most closely guarded operational activities. How long has he been compromised? The financial trail goes back 27 months. Payments from Redline to a series of shell accounts controlled by Aldrich, totaling approximately $1.2 million. He wasn't buying intelligence to resell. He was buying it to suppress. Specific targets on specific operation lists who were connected to business interests Aldrich had maintained through a private consulting firm he operated before his appointment. Arms dealers, logistics facilitators, financial intermediaries, people whose continued freedom was worth money to Aldrich's former clients. He was protecting his business partners, his former business partners, people he had worked with in the private sector who became targets of military operations after he moved into government. He used his oversight position to identify which operations threatened his network, purchased the operational details from Redline to confirm the targeting, and then used his policy authority to degrade the intelligence packages or recommend operational delays that gave the targets time to relocate. The scope of it was staggering, not just a single trader at a single base, but a corruption pipeline that ran from an administrative coordinator in Thornfield Harbor through a private intelligence broker to a senior Pentagon official who had been systematically undermining American military operations to protect his own financial interests. What's the timeline for arrest? FBI Counterintelligence Division is executing the warrant this afternoon. Aldrich will be taken into custody at his office in the Pentagon. The charges will include espionage, conspiracy, obstruction of military operations, and bribery of a public official. The Attorney General's office is personally overseeing the prosecution. And Price's deal? Modified. His cooperation on the client list earns him a sentencing recommendation. But the Aldrich case was built independently, so Price doesn't get credit for it. His attorney is not happy. Price will plead guilty to espionage and conspiracy charges with a recommended sentence of 35 years. No parole eligibility for 20. 35 years. Kira did the math. Price was 36. He would be 71 before he was eligible for release. The operations he had compromised, the injuries his betrayal had caused, the 6 weeks of terror Tyler Britton had endured, none of it could be undone. But the weight of the sentence at least acknowledged the gravity of what he had done. One more thing, Walsh said. Commander Calloway has formally requested that Meridian declassify your operational record for the Anvil Task Force personnel. Not the full Meridian file, just enough for the unit to understand your background, your qualifications, and the nature of the mission you conducted at Blackwall. He believes the team needs to know who they're serving with. And Meridian approved it? Reluctantly. You'll be the first Meridian operative whose cover has been formally lifted for a receiving unit. It sets a precedent they're not entirely comfortable with, but the circumstances are exceptional, and Calloway made a compelling case. That afternoon, Martin Aldrich was arrested at his desk in the Pentagon by FBI agents who walked him out of the building in handcuffs past the offices of colleagues who had worked beside him for 2 years without suspecting that the man reviewing their operational summaries was selling their soldiers' safety to protect arms dealers. The arrest made national news within hours. The Department of Defense issued a statement confirming that a senior civilian official had been charged with espionage-related offenses in connection with the compromise of special operations missions. The statement did not mention Blackwall, Task Force Anvil, Kira Ashford, or Meridian. It didn't need to. The people who mattered, the operators, the families, the chain of command, would learn the full story through classified channels. The public would get the version that the system was comfortable releasing. The Redline Solutions network was dismantled in its entirety over the following 2 weeks. Silas Drummond, the principal operator, pleaded not guilty to 47 federal charges and was denied bail. 3 additional Redline employees were arrested and cooperated with the investigation. The offshore financial infrastructure was frozen through international banking agreements, and partner intelligence agencies in 4 countries executed their own arrest warrants against Redline's foreign associates. The 31 clients on Price's memorized list were identified and referred to the appropriate investigative agencies. 23 were foreign nationals in countries with extradition agreements. 6 were in countries without such agreements but were placed on international watch lists and denied entry to allied nations. 2, Aldrich and 1 other domestic figure, a retired intelligence analyst who had been brokering information through Redline for personal profit, were prosecuted under federal law. Every compromised operation that Task Force Anvil had conducted during the 19 months of Price's activity was formally reviewed. Intelligence failures were reclassified, after-action reports were corrected, and the families of operators who had been injured as a result of compromised missions, including Rodriguez, whose shrapnel wounds had left him with permanent hearing loss in his left ear, and Park, whose internal injuries from the vehicle rollover had required 3 surgeries and 8 months of rehabilitation, were informed of the true circumstances behind the incidents, not through a form letter. Through personal visits from Commander Calloway, who sat in their living rooms and told them the truth and absorbed whatever response they gave him, because he believed that was the minimum obligation of a commander who had failed to protect his people from a threat he should have seen. He hadn't failed. Not really. The threat had been engineered to be invisible, but Calloway didn't deal in qualifications or excuses. He dealt in accountability, and the accountability was his, whether the failure was his fault or not. At Blackwall, the formal unit assembly took place on a Thursday morning, 14 days after Price's arrest. The entire task force gathered in the main briefing auditorium: operators, support staff, medical personnel, administrative teams. Commander Calloway stood at the front, and beside him stood Director Walsh and Kira Ashford. Kira was wearing her service uniform with full insignia for the first time since arriving at Blackwall. Not the medical support uniform she had worn as cover, her real uniform, bearing qualifications and service awards that no one in the room had seen before, including the Naval Special Warfare insignia, the military freefall badge, and the small, unadorned pin that identified her as a graduate of the Advanced Reconnaissance and Direct Action Training Program that produced the military's most versatile special operations medical personnel. The room was silent. Every eye was on her. Calloway spoke first. 14 days ago, a member of this unit's administrative staff was arrested for espionage. Nathan Price had been selling classified operational intelligence for 19 months, compromising missions, endangering lives, and enabling the kidnapping of a civilian family member of one of our operators. The investigation that exposed Price, dismantled the network behind him, and led to the arrest of a senior Pentagon official was conducted by one person. That person is standing next to me. He turned to Kira. Lieutenant Kira Ashford was placed at Blackwall under classified orders from a counterintelligence directorate tasked with identifying insider threats. She arrived as a Navy nurse. She operated undercover for 2 weeks, during which time she identified the source of the intelligence leak, built the evidence chain that led to Price's arrest, deployed with the strike team during Operation Stonewall, neutralized an armed hostile who was targeting Staff Sergeant Maddox, led the rescue operation that recovered Tyler Britton from a hostile facility, and coordinated with federal investigators to dismantle the Red Line Solutions network. Yima multutbeam. He paused. The silence in the room was total. Her classified service record has been partially declassified for this unit. Lieutenant Ashford is a qualified Special Operations Combat Medic, a graduate of the Advanced Reconnaissance Program, and holds the highest marksmanship qualification in the Navy's sniper certification pipeline. She is deployed to 7 operational theaters in roles that do not appear in any unclassified record. And effective today, she is a permanent member of Task Force Anvil. Calloway reached into his uniform pocket and produced a document. This is Lieutenant Ashford's probationary status removal. She was assigned to this unit on provisional orders. Those orders have been converted to permanent assignment at my personal request. He signed the document and held it out to her. You earned this. Kira took the document. Her hand was steady. Her face was composed. But something behind her eyes shifted. A release, a settling, the quiet recognition of something she hadn't realized she needed until it was given. Then Calloway turned back to the assembled unit and said, "On your feet." The room stood. Every operator, every support member, every corpsman and clerk and logistics specialist. They stood, and the silence held for one long, charged moment. And then Luke Maddox, the staff sergeant whose life she had saved in a dark courtyard with a pistol shot that shouldn't have been possible, raised his hand to his brow in a salute. Drew Britton followed. Then Holt. Then the team leaders, the junior operators, the medics. Briggs standing in the back row with his hand up and an expression on his face that said he had known all along that this woman was something the paperwork didn't describe. One by one, and then all at once, the entire task force saluted the woman they had once dismissed as a nobody. Kira stood there and received it. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The salute was not applause. It was recognition. The specific military recognition that said you are one of us and you have proven it beyond any standard we could have set. It was the thing she had never asked for, and the thing that mattered more than any classified commendation or medal pinned to a uniform in a room no one would ever see. After the formation, she walked to the recovery ward and sat with Tyler Britton for 20 minutes. He was eating lunch, actual lunch, solid food, sitting upright in bed, and he looked like a different person than the gaunt, hooded figure she had pulled from the back of a cargo van. He was talking more now, in longer sentences, with moments of humor that suggested the 19-year-old underneath the trauma was fighting his way back to the surface. "Drew says you're staying," Tyler said. "I am." "Good. This place needs someone who actually knows what they're doing." She laughed. It was the first real laugh she had produced in weeks, and it felt foreign and necessary and exactly right. That evening, Kira walked to the edge of the compound where the pavement ended and the rocky shoreline began. Thornfield Harbor stretched out in front of her, gray and cold and endless, the water moving with the kind of indifferent power that made human concerns feel proportionate. She thought about the 14 days since she had arrived, the transfer orders that nobody wanted, the thin personnel file, the commander who told her to stay out of the way, the operators who laughed when she walked into the briefing room, the master sergeant who called her dead weight, the corpsman who gave her 3 weeks before she quit. She thought about the training range, and the kid with the shattered leg, and the 90 seconds that made the difference. She thought about the encrypted messages she had sent from a tablet in the dark, and the pattern she had seen before anyone else looked for it, and the facility access logs that told the story nobody wanted to hear. She thought about the courtyard, and the shot, and the weight that came after. She thought about Tyler Britton's face when she removed the hood, about Drew Britton standing on the landing pad, unable to move, unable to speak, watching his brother walk toward him alive. She thought about Nathan Price sitting in a federal cell, facing 35 years for the price he had put on other people's lives. About Martin Aldrich in a different cell, facing the rest of his career and his freedom dissolving under the weight of evidence that traced every dollar and every betrayed operation back to his desk. About the families who had been told the truth, finally, about why their soldiers came home wounded. And she thought about the formation that morning. The silence, the salute, the document in Calloway's hand that said she belonged here, not as a cover identity, not as a temporary placement, but as herself. The wind off the harbor was sharp, carrying salt and the faint industrial smell of the docks, and the distant sound of helicopters cycling on the flight line. She stood there with her hands in her pockets and her face turned toward the water, and she let herself feel the things she rarely allowed. Not satisfaction, exactly, and not pride, but something closer to wholeness. The sense that the different parts of who she was, the medic, the operative, the sniper, the investigator, the woman who had spent years moving between identities and roles and cover stories, had finally converged in a single place where all of them were needed and all of them were known. She had spent her career being underestimated by instructors, by commanders, by the very people she was sent to protect. She had learned to use that underestimation as a tool to let people see what they expected to see and to operate in the space between their assumptions and reality. It was effective. It was necessary. And it was lonely in a way that operational training didn't prepare you for and that classified commendations didn't address. But loneliness was not the same as being alone. And standing here, at the edge of a base where she had been dismissed and mocked and tested and ultimately recognized, she understood something that the work itself had never taught her, that the most dangerous thing you could do in a room full of people who had decided you were nothing was simply to stay, to keep showing up, to do the work quietly and precisely and without asking for permission or approval, to let the results accumulate until the evidence was so overwhelming that the only people who could still deny it were the ones who had decided not to look. She had stayed. She had done the work. And the evidence was written in the arrest records of two men who would spend decades behind bars, in the medical charts of a young soldier who was walking again, in the reunion of two brothers who had been separated by greed, and in the salute of an entire unit that had learned the hard way what it cost to judge a person by the label on their uniform instead of the substance underneath it. Kira Ashford turned away from the harbor, walked back across the compound toward the barracks that were no longer temporary, and let the door close behind her. 12 days earlier, she had arrived at Blackwall as a nurse nobody wanted. Now she was the woman who had saved the unit, exposed the rot, brought the guilty to account, and brought a stolen kid home to his brother. And tomorrow, she would wake up, walk to the clinic, pull on her gloves, and start her shift. Because the work was never finished, the patients didn't wait. And the woman they thought was a nobody had always known exactly who she was. She just hadn't needed them to see it until now.